Welcome back, friends. This is Potter Fanfic Hub. Here we explore powerful Harry Potter what-if stories and hidden magic. What if Harry Potter outsmarted Voldemort at every turn? If you enjoy epic magical videos, subscribe to Potter Fanfic Hub. Now, let the story begin. Chapter 1. The cupboard under the stairs had never felt smaller than it did on the night Harry Potter turned 6. Not because he had grown, though he had, his knees now pressing against the door when he curled into his usual ball, but because something had shifted in the way he saw the world. It happened sometimes, these moments of clarity that came like cracks in the ceiling letting in thin shafts of light. He would be lying there, listening to the creak of the floorboards above, and suddenly the edges of things would sharpen. The way Aunt Petunia's lips pursed when she looked at him. The way Uncle Vernon's face went purple when Harry asked a question. The way Dudley's friends laughed at things that weren't funny, things that were cruel, and how nobody ever told them to stop. Harry had learned early that asking why was dangerous. Why did he have to sleep in the cupboard? Why did Dudley get 2 birthdays every year and he got none? Why did his parents die in a car crash, and why did nobody ever talk about it? Why did strange things happen when he got angry or scared, things he couldn't explain, like the time he'd found himself on the school roof or the time Aunt Petunia's horrible vase had simply exploded? The questions piled up inside him like stones in a wall. And the wall was getting higher. On this particular night, rain lashed against the window of the cupboard, the tiny, barred window that let in just enough light for him to see the cracks in the ceiling. Harry lay on his thin mattress, staring up at those cracks, and he thought about the way adults talked to him. Not just his aunt and uncle, though they were the worst. All of them. Teachers who smiled too brightly and spoke in that careful, patronizing tone. Neighbors who looked away too quickly. The man at the ice cream shop who'd muttered something about that poor boy, before pretending Harry couldn't hear. They all knew something. Something they weren't telling him. And Harry had begun to wonder, what if that something was the reason they all treated him like a bomb waiting to go off? He remembered the day he'd asked his aunt about his mother. He'd been 4, maybe 5, and he'd been so desperate for any scrap of information that he'd risked the back of Uncle Vernon's hand. What was she like? He'd asked, his voice small. And Aunt Petunia had gone white then red, and her thin hands had trembled as she'd gripped the edge of the counter. She was a freak, she'd hissed. Just like you. Then she'd slammed the cupboard door and left him in darkness for 2 days. Freak. The word had followed him ever since. It was the word teachers used when they caught him doing something impossible. The word Dudley and his friends whispered when they thought Harry couldn't hear. The word that lived in the silences between sentences, in the looks adults gave each other when they thought he wasn't paying attention. But Harry was always paying attention. That was the thing. He'd learned to be quiet, to make himself small, to watch and listen and remember. And what he remembered was piling up into a shape that didn't make sense. If his parents had died in a car crash, why did no one have a photograph? If they were normal people, why did everyone whisper? If he was just an ordinary boy, just like they always told him he should be, then why did everything about him feel so wrong? The rain drummed on the roof. Harry pulled his thin blanket tighter and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself thinking about the snake. The one at the zoo, the boa constrictor that had looked at him with such knowing, ancient eyes. Harry had felt something pass between them, something wordless and profound. And when the glass had vanished and the snake had slithered free, Harry had felt proud, excited, terrified, alive. And Dudley had screamed, and Uncle Vernon had yelled, and Harry had been locked in the cupboard for a week. But he hadn't been sorry. Even now, a year later, he wasn't sorry. Because in that moment, the snake had looked at him like he mattered. Like he was a person, not a burden. Like they shared a secret that nobody else could understand. Maybe that was the real reason people were afraid of him. Not because of the things that happened when he lost control, though that was part of it, but because he saw them. Really saw them. He saw their fear and their lies and their desperate need to believe that the world made sense. And when he looked at them, When his green eyes met theirs, they knew. They knew that he knew. Harry sat up slowly, his head brushing against the underside of the stairs. Outside, thunder rumbled. Inside, his heart beat a steady, deliberate rhythm against his ribs. He was 6 years old, and he had already learned the most important lesson of his life. Nobody was going to tell him the truth. He was going to have to find it himself. The summer he turned 7, Harry discovered the library. Not the little room at school with its dog-eared picture books and broken chairs. The real library, the one in the center of Little Whinging, with its tall windows and dusty smell and row upon row of books that no one else seemed to want. Harry had walked past it 100 times, always with Dudley or Aunt Petunia, always being dragged away before he could stop and look. But one afternoon, when Dudley was at his friend Pierce's house and Aunt Petunia was too busy watching her programs on the television to notice him slipping out the back door, Harry found himself standing in front of those great wooden doors, his hand pressed against the brass handle. The air inside was cool and still. A woman with spectacles and a kind face looked up from the front desk and smiled at him. "Hello, dear. Looking for something in particular?" Harry hesitated. He'd never been in a place like this before. Everywhere he went, people seemed to expect something from him: anger, suspicion, fear. But this woman was looking at him like he was just another child in a library. Like he had every right to be there. I want to learn things," he said carefully. "About history, maybe. And laws. And—" He trailed off, not sure how to explain the hunger inside him. The need to understand why the world worked the way it did. Why some people had everything and some people had nothing. Why everyone seemed so certain about things that felt wrong to him. The librarian's smile widened. "History and law, is it? That's a lot for a boy your age. But I think I know just where to start." She led him through the stacks, her voice low and warm, pointing out sections that made Harry's head spin. Ancient history. Modern history. British history. World history. Laws and legal systems. Political philosophy. Military strategy. "Do you like to read, dear?" she asked as she handed him a heavy volume called The History of Britain, from the Romans to the present. Harry nodded, not trusting his voice. The weight of the book in his hands felt like a promise. "I get that a lot," she said softly. "The ones who read the most are always the ones with the most questions. That's not a bad thing, you know. It means you're paying attention." She left him at a small table by the window, and Harry opened the book. The first chapter was about the Romans, about roads and baths and something called civilization. Harry read the words twice, 3 times, not because they were hard to understand but because he wanted to make sure he wasn't missing anything. The book talked about power, about how the Romans had conquered half the world by building alliances and crushing their enemies. It talked about laws, about how the Romans had written everything down so that everyone knew the rules. It talked about strategy, about how the Romans had won battles before they ever set foot on the battlefield by being smarter, more organized, more patient than their enemies. Harry read until the light began to fade, then he read some more. When the librarian came to tell him the library was closing, he looked up with eyes that were tired but hungry. "Can I take this home? Please?" "I'm sorry, dear. This one's a reference book. But I can show you where we keep the history books that you can take out." By the time Harry stumbled back to number 4, Privet Drive, his arms were full of books and his mind was full of questions. He'd hidden them in his cupboard. There was a loose floorboard under the mattress where he kept his secret things, and that night, by the light of a flashlight he nicked from the garage, he read until his eyes burned. He read about kings and queens, about wars and treaties, about how people had built the world they lived in. He read about revolutions, about how sometimes ordinary people got tired of being told what to do and rose up against the ones who controlled them. He read about spies and double agents, about how a single well-placed piece of information could win a war. He read about Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, names that meant nothing to him but whose ideas opened doors in his mind that he hadn't even known were there. And he started to notice patterns. The same stories, over and over. Powerful people who got too comfortable and were overthrown. Ordinary people who banded together against impossible odds. Good people who failed because they didn't understand how evil thought. And evil people who failed because they underestimated everyone else. By the time autumn came, Harry had worked his way through every history book the library had. He'd moved on to biographies, to strategy, to political theory, to anything that might help him understand the shape of the world. He'd learned to read fast, to skim for the important parts, to connect ideas across different books. He'd learned to ask questions, even if he couldn't ask them out loud. What would he have done? What would he have done differently? How could someone have seen the trap before it sprang? The answers weren't always clear. But the questions were getting sharper, more focused. And Harry had begun to notice something else, too, the way people talked about magic. Not directly, of course. Nobody in Little Whinging ever talked about magic directly. But Harry heard the whispers. He saw the way Aunt Petunia's eyes darted to the fireplace when he walked into the room. He noticed the strange symbols carved into the doorframes of the old houses on the edges of town. He found books in the library that had pages torn out, chapters missing, whole sections that seemed to have been erased from history. Someone had tried to hide something. Someone had tried to make the world forget. But Harry had learned that secrets didn't stay buried forever. They always had a way of crawling back to the surface. And he was going to find them. All of them. On the morning of his 11th birthday, Harry woke to the sound of owls. He blinked in the darkness of his cupboard, disoriented. The sound was strange, muffled, like something scratching at the door. For a moment, he thought it might be Dudley playing some kind of trick, trying to scare him. But when he pressed his ear to the wood, he heard something else: wings. Feathers. The soft hoot of an owl just outside the kitchen window. Harry's heart raced. He'd never had an owl come to him before. But he'd read about owls in some of the older books, the ones that talked about strange things, hidden things, things that most people didn't believe in. Slowly, carefully, Harry pulled himself out of bed and crept toward the kitchen. The house was dark and silent. Uncle Vernon wouldn't wake for another hour, and Aunt Petunia always slept until Dudley's alarm clock went off. Harry moved like a shadow, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. The kitchen was empty. But sitting on the windowsill, its head cocked and its golden eyes watching him, was a snowy owl with a letter clutched in its beak. Harry's heart stopped. The owl extended its leg, and Harry reached out with trembling hands to take the letter. The owl hooted softly, then took off into the gray morning sky, leaving Harry alone with a rectangular piece of thick, creamy paper. He stared at it. His name was written on the front in emerald green ink, the letters curling and looping like something from a storybook. It felt heavy in his hands, important. He turned it over and saw, on the back, a coat of arms, a lion, a snake, a badger, and an eagle around a giant letter H. Harry's fingers shook as he opened the letter and began to read. Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He read the words 3 times, then a 4th. His mind raced, searching for any explanation other than the one staring him in the face. A prank. A joke. Some elaborate hoax orchestrated by Dudley's friends to humiliate him. But the letter felt too real, too solid. The paper had a texture he'd never felt before, like it was woven from moonlight. The ink shimmered faintly in the pale morning light. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Harry had seen those words before. Or words like them. In the margins of the library books, written in handwriting that was different from the printed text. In the patterns that appeared in the dust when the sun hit the floor just right. In the shapes that he saw when he closed his eyes at night, shapes that moved and writhed and whispered things he couldn't quite understand. Magic. It was real. It had always been real. And Harry Potter, the boy in the cupboard, the boy who was a freak and a burden and a secret that everyone was trying to keep, was part of it. He was still staring at the letter when the doorbell rang. Uncle Vernon's heavy footsteps shook the house. Harry shoved the letter into his pocket just as his uncle yanked open the front door. What do you want? Vernon snarled. I'm afraid I don't have much time, Mr. Dursley, came a voice like gravel in a velvet bag. But I need to speak with the boy. It's rather important. Harry crept forward, peeking around the corner. A giant of a man stood in the doorway, his face almost entirely hidden by a wild tangle of dark hair and a beard that could have housed a small family of birds. He was enormous, twice the size of any ordinary man, and he was wearing what looked like a long, dark coat over bright purple robes. Who the bloody hell are you? Vernon demanded. The man's beard parted in what might have been a smile. Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts. I believe the boy has already received my letter? He peered over Vernon's shoulder, and his eyes, beetle-black and surprisingly sharp, found Harry's instantly. Ah, there you are, Harry. I was wondering when you'd show yourself. Harry stepped forward, his heart pounding. You know me? Know you? Hagrid laughed, and it was like thunder rolling across a mountain. Of course I know you, Harry. I've known you since you were a tiny little thing, barely more than a week old. I'm the one who brought you here, see? I carried you right up to that front door. He jerked his head toward the house. The night your parents, well, the night it happened. Harry's blood turned to ice. My parents? What happened to them? Everyone always says it was a car crash, but I never believed. A car crash? Hagrid's face went white with fury. A car crash. That's what they told you. Your parents weren't killed in any car crash, Harry. They were murdered. By the most evil wizard in history. And you. He bent down, his massive hands gripping Harry's shoulders. You, Harry Potter, are the only one who ever survived his killing curse. You're famous, you are. The boy who lived. The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind reeling. Murdered. Evil wizard. Killing curse. The boy who lived. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But somehow, looking into Hagrid's face, seeing the grief and anger and fierce protectiveness in those beetle-black eyes, Harry knew it was true. The Dark Lord tried to kill you, Harry. He killed your parents, but he couldn't kill you. And that... Hagrid's voice dropped to a whisper. That's why you've been here all these years. To keep you safe from his followers. To make sure you survived to fight another day. Harry's mind was a hurricane of questions. How? Why? Who? But the most important question, the one that had been burning inside him for years, finally broke through. What is Hogwarts? What is all of this? I've read books about magic, I've seen things, but I never knew. Hagrid's smile returned. I'll tell you everything, Harry. But not here. Not with the Muggles. He gave Vernon a look of pure contempt. We've got a lot to talk about, you and me. Harry didn't look back as he followed Hagrid out the door. He could feel Uncle Vernon's fury burning in the air behind him, the helpless rage of a man who just discovered that the boy he tried to crush wasn't a freak at all, he was a wizard. Something far more dangerous than a freak. He was something that couldn't be controlled. Hogwarts came to Harry in fragments, pieces of a puzzle he'd been assembling his entire life. The dark water of the lake that stretched beneath the castle, depths unplumbed and full of ancient things. The moving staircases that shifted and rearranged themselves like living creatures. The ghosts that drifted through the hallways, trailing whispers of a past that refused to die. The enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall, which looked up at a starry sky that wasn't quite the same as the one outside. And the people. So many people. All of them looking at him with that same expression. He'd seen his whole life, fear and fascination, curiosity and suspicion. The boy who lived. The one who'd survived something nobody else had. But Harry had learned something in the past 11 years. He'd learned to be careful. He'd learned to watch, to wait, to listen. And the more he watched, the more he realized that everyone at Hogwarts was playing a game he didn't understand. The headmaster, Dumbledore, with his twinkling eyes and cryptic speeches. The teachers, each with their own agenda and secrets. The students, split into houses that seemed to define their entire futures. The Sorting Hat that had tried to put him in Slytherin, the house of cunning and ambition, before Harry had whispered, "Not Slytherin, not Slytherin," and the Hat had relented. But the Hat's words had stayed with him. Asterisk. You could be great, you know. It's all in your head. Slytherin would help you on the way to greatness. Asterisk. Harry had said no. He'd chosen Gryffindor, the house of courage and daring. He'd wanted to be brave, to be good, to be everything his parents would have wanted. But in the weeks that followed, he'd begun to wonder if he'd made the right choice. Because greatness wasn't just about courage. It was about strategy. It was about seeing the board and understanding the pieces. It was about knowing when to strike and when to wait. And Harry had spent years learning those lessons. He'd read every book he could find about war and politics and deception. He knew how power worked. He knew how to move in silence, how to gather information, how to build alliances. He also knew that nobody at Hogwarts was telling him the truth. Not Dumbledore, who smiled too much and told too many riddles. Not the teachers, who talked about his parents as if they'd been perfect heroes who never made mistakes. Not the students, who whispered about Harry Potter as if he were a myth instead of a boy who'd spent 11 years in a cupboard under the stairs. Something was wrong. Something was hidden. And Harry was going to find it. The first clue came in the form of a conversation he overheard in the corridors, weeks into his first year. It was late, past curfew, and Harry was wandering the halls with his invisibility cloak, a gift that had arrived anonymously at Christmas, with a note that just said, asterisk. Use it well. Asterisk. He'd been exploring the castle, mapping its secret passages and hidden rooms, when he'd heard voices around a corner. The stone. He's after it. I'd bet my life on it. Snape's voice, low and venomous. The Dark Lord is not what he once was, Severus. Quirrell's stutter had vanished, replaced by something cold and precise. But he is not the only one with plans. There are others who seek the stone. Others who would use it to restore him to power. Then we must protect it. The headmaster. The headmaster is a fool. He trusts too easily. He thinks his little games of chess and logic will protect the stone. But there are players on the board he hasn't seen. Harry pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering. The stone. A Dark Lord. Players on the board he hadn't seen. He crept closer, his cloak pulled tight around him. We need to find the boy, Snape said. Potter. He's the key. If the Dark Lord gets to him first. He won't. The boy is safe. For now. But I have my own plans, Severus. Plans that don't involve trusting a man who's made more mistakes than victories. There was a long silence. Then Snape spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. You're playing a dangerous game, Quirrell. All games are dangerous when the stakes are this high. But I've been playing longer than you realize. And I know how to win. The voices moved away, fading into the darkness. Harry stood frozen, his mind racing. A stone. A Dark Lord. Players he hadn't seen. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Harry Potter. The boy who lived. A pawn in a game he didn't understand. Harry's hands clenched into fists. He'd spent his entire life being a pawn. Being moved around by people who thought they knew better. Being told what to do and where to go and who to be. And he'd had enough. If there was a game being played, then Harry was going to learn the rules. He was going to understand the pieces. And when he understood the board, he was going to change the way the game was played. He slipped back through the corridors, his mind already working, already planning. He would find the stone. He would find out who was after it. He would protect it in a way that nobody saw coming. And when the game was over, Harry Potter would no longer be a pawn. He would be the one holding the pieces. The library became his sanctuary. Not the main library, with its creaking floors and Madame Pance's sharp eyes. The restricted section. The place where the real secrets were kept. Harry spent every free moment there, reading books that would have sent most first-year students running. He read about dark magic and its history, about the wars that had torn the wizarding world apart, about the families that had risen and fallen and risen again. He read about the Ministry of Magic, about its laws and its politics, about the corruption that ate at its foundations. He read about Voldemort, the Dark Lord who had terrorized Britain for a decade, and he read about the Order of the Phoenix, the organization that had tried to stop him. The more he read, the more certain he became. Voldemort wasn't dead. He was out there, waiting, scheming. And everything that was happening at Hogwarts, the stone, the attacks, the whispers in the corridors, was part of a larger plan. But Harry wasn't going to sit back and let it happen. He started with the clues. The stone was hidden somewhere in the castle, protected by a series of traps and enchantments. But why? If Dumbledore wanted it protected, why not just destroy it? Why leave it where someone might find it? Harry thought about it for days. He turned the question over and over in his mind, examining it from every angle. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Dumbledore hadn't hidden the stone to protect it. He'd hidden it as bait. He was waiting for someone to try to steal it. Someone who knew about the stone, someone who had a connection to Voldemort. Someone like Quirrell. Harry remembered the conversation he'd overheard. Quirrell had said he had plans of his own. Plans that involved the boy. Harry. He looked at his reflection in the black mirror of the window. The boy who lived. The one who'd survived the killing curse. The one who was supposed to be the key to everything. Well, Harry thought, he wasn't going to be anyone's key. If Quirrell was planning to use Harry to get to the stone, then Harry was going to be ready. He was going to turn the trap back on its maker. The first step was to learn everything he could about Quirrell. About the man's history, his weaknesses, his blind spots. Harry started with the teachers. He listened to their conversations, picked up on the subtle tensions and alliances. He watched Quirrell in class, studied the way he moved, the way he talked. He noticed the stutter that came and went, the trembling that seemed to vanish when Quirrell thought no one was watching. Quirrell was playing a role. He was pretending to be weak, afraid, barely competent. But Harry had seen that same act before. He'd seen it in the eyes of the bullies at school, the ones who pretended to be stupid so that no one would expect them to be clever. And it wasn't clever. It was desperate. It was the act of someone who was hiding something so important that he'd do anything to keep it secret. Harry started to plan. He found the trapdoor beneath the third-floor corridor. He watched from his cloak as Hagrid led him past it, pointing out the dangers, casually mentioning the things that would protect the stone. A three-headed dog. Devil's snare. A deadly chess game. A troll. A logic puzzle. And finally, a mirror that showed you your deepest desire. Harry catalogued them all. Each trap was a piece of a larger puzzle. Each one had a weakness, a way through. And if he was going to stop Quirrell, stop Voldemort, he needed to understand how all the pieces fit together. He spent weeks working on it. He studied the books on the restricted section, cross-referencing spells and potions and enchantments. He drew maps of the castle, marking the hidden passages and secret rooms. He timed the patrols, mapped the schedules, identified the moments when no one would be watching. He began to notice other things, too. The way the Slytherins watched him with hungry eyes. The way Dumbledore's gaze lingered on him a little too long. The way Professor McGonagall's mouth tightened when she saw him in the corridors, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Everyone was watching him. Everyone had plans for him. And Harry had to decide, was he going to let them use him, or was he going to use them? The answer came to him in the middle of the night, while he was lying in his four-poster bed, staring at the canopy above him. Use them. Of course. He wasn't going to resist their plans. He was going to make them his own. He was going to take their expectations and turn them into weapons. When Quirrell came for the stone, when Voldemort made his move, Harry would be ready. He would be in the right place at the right time. But he wasn't going to fight Voldemort directly. He wasn't stupid enough to think he could win that fight. Instead, he was going to lay traps of his own. He was going to expose Quirrell, to force the Dark Lord into the open, to make the wizarding world see what had been hiding right under their noses. And when the dust settled, Harry would be the one holding the pieces. He smiled in the darkness. Let them come. The night came sooner than he expected. Harry was in the common room, studying for his exams, when he felt it. A shiver down his spine, a warning that something was about to happen. He looked up from his book and saw Hermione and Ron sitting across from him, their faces pale and drawn. Harry, Hermione said quietly, there's something you need to know. About the stone. About what's been happening. Harry set down his book. I know about the stone. Hermione's eyes widened. You do? I know about the traps. I know about the protection. I know that someone's trying to steal it, and I know it's Quirrell. Ron's jaw dropped. How did you? I pay attention. Harry's voice was calm, controlled. That's what I do. I watch, and I wait, and I figure things out. And right now, I'm pretty sure Quirrell's going to make his move tonight. Hermione's face went white. Then we have to stop him. We have to tell Professor Dumbledore, we have to. Dumbledore's not here, Harry said. He's been called away to London. And even if he were here, I'm not sure I'd tell him. You can't be serious, Ron said. You're not going to go after Quirrell by yourself? You're just a kid, Harry. We're all just kids. Harry stood. You're right. We're just kids. And that's exactly why nobody will expect us to do anything. They'll see us as weak, as naive, as pawns in their game. But they're wrong. We're not pawns. We're players. He looked from Ron to Hermione, his green eyes burning with a fire they'd never seen before. I'm going down there. I'm going to stop Quirrell. But I'm not going to fight him. Not directly. I'm going to trap him. I'm going to show everyone what he really is. Hermione stood too. Then we're coming with you. No. You're not. Harry's voice was firm. This is something I have to do alone. But I need you to help me in another way. He pulled out a piece of parchment and began to write. I need you to get this message to Professor Snape. Tell him everything you know about Quirrell. Tell him I'm going to the 3rd floor. Tell him to follow, but to stay hidden. And tell him... Harry paused. Tell him I know what he is. I know who he's trying to protect. Ron stared at him. You know Snape? You've been working with Snape? No. But I know he's not the one after the stone. And I know he's been watching Quirrell just as closely as I have. Harry folded the note and pressed it into Ron's hand. Can you do this? Ron swallowed hard. Yeah, I think so. Good. Harry turned toward the door. Then I'll see you on the other side. The common room felt smaller as he walked toward the portrait hole. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Hermione called out after him, her voice trembling. Harry, be careful. Harry paused at the door. His reflection in the glass was that of a boy who'd spent years being told he was nothing. A boy who'd learned to be small, to be quiet, to be invisible. But as he looked at himself, he saw something else. He saw a boy who'd decided to be something more. I'm always careful, he said. That's what they don't understand. I've been careful my whole life. It's the only thing I know how to do. He opened the portrait hole and stepped into the corridor. And tonight I'm going to show them what careful looks like. The castle was dark and silent. Harry moved through the shadows, his steps sure and steady. He'd memorized every twist and turn, every hidden door and secret passage. He knew this castle better than anyone, and he was going to use that knowledge to his advantage. The 3rd floor corridor loomed ahead of him. The door was slightly ajar, and Harry could hear music drifting through the crack. Soft, hypnotic music. The sound of a harp. Quirrell was already inside. Harry took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was lit by a soft, eerie glow. The 3-headed dog lay curled in the corner, snoring peacefully. And there, standing in front of the trapdoor, was Quirrell. His turban was unwound, and his face was twisted with concentration as he played the harp. Harry stepped into the room, his cloak still wrapped around him. He moved silently, positioning himself in the shadows near the wall. He watched as Quirrell finished playing and tucked the harp away. The dog didn't stir. Quirrell turned toward the trapdoor and began to lower himself through it. Harry followed, his heart pounding but his mind clear. He knew what he had to do. The traps came one by one. The devil's snare, which Harry had already figured out how to defeat. The flying keys, which he'd studied enough to understand. The life-size chess game, which he'd already won in his mind 100 times. The troll, which he sidestepped with ease. And then the final chamber. The mirror of Eris stood in the center of the room, its golden frame glinting in the torchlight. Quirrell was standing in front of it, his back to Harry, his hands outstretched. "I see it," he whispered. "I see the stone. It's right there. Just out of reach." Harry stepped forward, letting his cloak fall. "It's not going to work, Quirrell." Quirrell spun around, his eyes wide with shock. "Potter? How did you?" "I've been watching you," Harry said. "I've been watching everyone. And I know what you're doing. You're not here to steal the stone. You're here to give it to him. To Voldemort." Quirrell's face twisted with rage. "You don't know anything, boy. You're just a child, playing at grown-up games. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand more than you think." Harry's voice was calm, measured. "I understand that Voldemort is using you. I understand that you're nothing more than a vessel for him. And I understand that the stone isn't going to help him. It's just a piece of the puzzle. A distraction." Quirrell's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've already won." Harry gestured toward the mirror. "You can't get the stone because you're not pure of heart. You want it for selfish reasons. You want to use it to bring Voldemort back. But the mirror doesn't work that way. It shows you what you desire, not what you can have." Quirrell took a step back, his face pale. "You're lying." "Am I?" Harry moved closer. "I've been playing this game for months, Quirrell. I've been learning everything I can. And I've figured out the one thing none of you expected: I'm not just a pawn. I'm a player." He raised his hand and touched the mirror. The surface rippled, and Harry watched as his reflection smiled at him. The boy in the mirror reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and red. The Philosopher's Stone. Harry's reflection winked at him, and then the stone was gone. "What?" Quirrell's face went white. "What did you do?" "I outsmarted you," Harry said. "Just like I outsmarted everyone. You see, Quirrell, you thought you were playing a simple game. You thought that if you could just get past the traps, you'd win. But I've been planning this moment for weeks. I've been laying traps of my own." He raised his voice. "Professor Snape, I know you're there. You can come out now." The shadows at the edge of the room shifted, and Snape stepped forward. His face was unreadable, but his wand was raised and pointed directly at Quirrell. "Impressive, Potter," Snape said softly. "Very impressive." Quirrell screamed. The sound was inhuman, distorted, as if something inside him was fighting to get out. His face contorted, and Harry could see what was beneath the turban now. A face. Voldemort's face. A skull-like visage with red eyes and a slit of a mouth. "Kill him!" Voldemort's voice was high, cold, awful. "Kill the boy!" Snape's wand flew, but Harry was already moving. He'd planned for this too. He'd studied everything he could about the Dark Lord, about his weaknesses, about what could hurt him. And he knew, he'd known for weeks, that the only thing Voldemort feared was the person who had already beaten him. Harry touched his forehead. The scar burned, but he pushed through the pain. He held his mother's protection like a shield. Quirrell lunged. Harry dodged, and Quirrell's hands clutched at him, touching him. And Quirrell screamed. The touch burned. Harry could see it, the flesh of Quirrell's hands turning black, withering. Quirrell fell to the ground, writhing, and Harry stepped back, his heart racing, his body trembling. "Get away from me, you freak!" Quirrell's voice died in his throat. The skin of his face was peeling back, revealing the skull beneath. And then, With a final, terrible cry, Quirrell collapsed. The body hit the floor and lay still. The air was thick with the smell of burning. Harry stood over the body, his breathing ragged, his scar still throbbing with pain. He'd won. He'd actually won. Snape moved forward, his wand still raised. "The Dark Lord is gone," he said quietly. "He's fled. But he'll be back, Potter. He'll always be back." Harry nodded slowly. "I know. You didn't tell anyone, did you? You kept this all to yourself? You planned this without any help?" "I told you," Harry said. "I've been paying attention. I've been learning. And I've been preparing for this moment for months." He looked at Snape, his eyes steady. "I'm not a pawn, Professor. Not anymore." Snape studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "No, Potter. I don't think you are." The great hall was silent. Everyone was watching Harry as he walked to the front, his steps slow and deliberate. He could feel their eyes on him, students and teachers alike, all wondering what had happened, all hungry for the story he was about to tell. He'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head. He knew exactly what he was going to say. Dumbledore stood at the front of the hall, his eyes twinkling behind his half-moon spectacles. "Harry," he said gently, "would you like to tell us what happened?" Harry took a deep breath. "Professor Quirrell is dead." The hall erupted in gasps and murmurs. Harry raised his hand, and silence fell again. "He was working for Voldemort," Harry said, and the name sent a chill through the room. "He was trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone to bring the Dark Lord back. But I stopped him." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I planned for this. I've been planning for this since the beginning of the year." He turned to face the room, his voice steady and clear. "I know you all think of me as a pawn. Someone to be moved around, someone to be protected. But I'm not. I've spent the last 11 years being told what to do, being hidden and protected and lied to. And I'm done with it." He looked at Dumbledore, his eyes hard. "You knew, didn't you? You knew Quirrell was working for Voldemort. You knew the stone was bait. And you let it happen. You let me be a pawn in your game." Dumbledore's face was unreadable. "Harry, I don't want to hear it." Harry's voice was sharp. "I've heard enough. I've read enough. I understand enough to know that I can't trust anyone. Not you. Not the Ministry. Not the teachers. No one." He turned back to the hall. "From now on, I'm playing my own game. I'm going to learn everything I can about magic, about Voldemort, about the power he holds. And when he comes back, and he will come back, I'm going to be ready. I'm going to be the one holding the pieces." He let his gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of his classmates, his teachers, his headmaster. "I'm not a pawn anymore," he said. "And I'm never going to be one again." The silence that followed was absolute. Harry felt the weight of it pressing down on him, the fear, the awe, the suspicion. He'd drawn a line in the sand. He'd shown everyone exactly who he was and what he intended to do. And whatever happened next, Harry knew one thing for certain. The game had changed. The sun was rising over Hogwarts as Harry walked through the corridors for the last time that year. He'd said his goodbyes, packed his bags, and was making his way toward the boat that would carry him across the lake. But his mind was already elsewhere. Already planning. Already strategizing. He stopped at the edge of the grounds and looked back at the castle. It was beautiful, ancient, and full of secrets. And Harry Potter was going to uncover every single one of them. "You're quite something, Harry." Harry turned. Dumbledore was standing behind him, his robes billowing in the wind. For a moment, Harry thought he looked sad. Tired. Old. "I'm not going to apologize," Harry said. "For what I did. For what I said. It needed to be said." "I know, Harry." Dumbledore's voice was gentle. "I don't blame you for being angry. You're right, of course. I've been playing my own game, and I've been using you as a piece. I should have trusted you more. I should have told you the truth. Then why didn't you? Dumbledore was silent for a long moment. Because I was afraid, he said finally. Afraid of what you might become if you knew too much. Afraid of what you might do. Harry's eyes narrowed. And what do you think I'm going to become now? Dumbledore smiled. It was a sad smile, full of regret and wisdom. I think you're going to become exactly what the wizarding world needs, he said. Someone who thinks for himself. Someone who refuses to be controlled. Someone who is willing to do whatever it takes to win. Harry held the old man's gaze. And what if what it takes is more than you're willing to give? Dumbledore's eyes flickered with something, fear, perhaps, or hope. Then I'll have to trust that you know what you're doing. Harry nodded slowly. He turned back toward the lake, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he'd learned. He'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. Voldemort was still out there, waiting, scheming. And Harry was going to need all the help he could get. But first, he needed to plan. He needed to build his network, gather his resources, understand the game in a way that no one else did. He needed to become the player he'd always suspected he could be. Harry, Dumbledore said, his voice carrying across the water. One more thing. Harry turned back. Be careful, Dumbledore said. The path you're walking is a dangerous one. There's a reason I've been keeping secrets. There's a reason I've been holding back. Some knowledge is dangerous. Some knowledge can destroy you. Harry smiled. It was a thin smile, cold and sharp as a blade. I know, he said. That's exactly why I'm going to find it. The boat lurched forward, carrying him across the glassy water. Harry watched as the castle grew smaller and smaller, his mind already racing ahead to the next move. He'd won the first round. But the real game was just beginning. He touched his forehead, feeling the faint throb of the scar. Somewhere out there, Voldemort was already planning his return. Somewhere out there, the pieces were already moving. But Harry Potter wasn't a pawn anymore. He was the one who saw the board. The one who understood the game. And he had every intention of winning. The end of Chapter 1. #Building an Invisible Empire. #Chapter 2. The summer after his first year at Hogwarts was the longest of Harry's life. Not because he was trapped in the cupboard under the stairs, though he was, for the first 2 weeks, until Uncle Vernon's fury subsided enough to allow him back into the small bedroom Dudley had outgrown. Not because he missed his friends, though he did, with a hollow ache that surprised him with its intensity. No, the summer was long because Harry Potter had finally found his purpose, and he was desperate to act on it. Every night, he lay awake in the darkness, his mind churning with plans and strategies. He'd spent his first year at Hogwarts learning the rules of the game. Now he needed to learn how to break them. The library in Little Whinging, once his sanctuary, now felt painfully inadequate. The books he'd devoured as a child, history, politics, strategy, seemed thin and incomplete compared to what he'd discovered in the restricted section at Hogwarts. But they were all he had. So Harry read them again, looking for patterns he'd missed before. He wrote notes in a small, hidden journal, cross-referencing magical law with Muggle history, military tactics with political philosophy. He was building a framework. A way of thinking that would allow him to see the board more clearly than anyone else. But the framework wasn't enough. He needed information. He needed allies. He needed to understand the intricate web of power that governed the wizarding world, and he needed to find his place within it. The letter arrived 3 weeks before the start of term. Harry was in his bedroom, the door locked against Dudley's prying eyes, when Hedwig swooped through the window with a scroll clutched in her beak. He recognized the handwriting immediately, Hermione's precise, looping script, and tore it open with shaking hands. Dear Harry. I've been thinking about what you said at the end of term. About building a network. About understanding the game. I've been doing some research over the summer, and I think I've found something that might help. There's an organization called the Society for the Preservation of Magical Knowledge. It's not officially recognized by the Ministry, but it's been around for centuries, since long before the statute of secrecy. They collect and preserve magical knowledge that would otherwise be lost. Old spells, forgotten histories, family traditions. I've managed to get my hands on some of their catalogs, and they contain references to things I've never seen anywhere else. Asterisk. Asterisk also, I've been corresponding with some of the older students at Hogwarts. Ravenclaws, mostly. They're interested in what you said about playing the game. They're not sure they trust you yet, but they're willing to listen. Asterisk. I'll tell you more when I see you. Hermione. Asterisk P.S. Ron says hello? He also says he's been practicing his chess. He wants a rematch. Asterisk. Harry read the letter 3 times, then a 4th. Hermione had already started building connections. She'd already begun to understand what he was trying to do. He smiled in the darkness of his room. He wasn't alone in this. He had allies. He had resources. And he had a plan that was starting to take shape. The sorting feast of Harry's second year was a blur of faces and voices, but Harry's attention was elsewhere. He watched the new students as they approached the sorting hat, studying their expressions, their posture, their reactions. He catalogued them, the ones who were nervous, the ones who were eager, the ones who were afraid. He made mental notes about their families, their backgrounds, their potential uses. He'd learned something important in his first year. Everyone had a role to play. The question was whether they knew it. Hermione found him after the feast, her face flushed with excitement. Harry! I've been wanting to talk to you all summer. There's so much to tell you. They found a quiet corner in the Gryffindor common room, away from the noise and celebration. Ron joined them a few minutes later, his arms full of snacks he'd managed to liberate from the feast. Right, Ron said, settling into a chair. What's the plan? Harry looked at them, his 2 closest friends, the ones who'd stood by him when everything had gone wrong, and felt a surge of gratitude so intense it almost hurt. The plan is simple, he said. We need information. We need allies. And we need to start building a network that no one will suspect. He pulled out a piece of parchment, the first of many, and began to sketch. I've been thinking about this for months. The wizarding world is divided into factions. The Ministry, the Pureblood families, the Order of the Phoenix, the Death Eaters. Each group has its own agenda, its own secrets. And right now, none of them are working together. Hermione nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. You want to create a neutral faction. A group that isn't aligned with any of the existing powers. Exactly. Harry drew a circle in the center of the parchment. We'll be the ones who see the whole board. We'll collect information from everyone, understand everyone's moves, and use that knowledge to protect ourselves and the people we care about. But how do we get people to trust us? Ron asked. I mean, we're just kids. Nobody's going to tell us their secrets. Harry smiled. They will if we give them something in return. We'll start small. We'll help people with their problems, share information they don't have, make ourselves useful. And little by little, they'll start to see us as valuable. As necessary. He looked at his friends, his green eyes burning with intensity. This isn't going to be quick. It's not going to be easy. But if we do it right, we'll build something that no one can break. Something that will survive Voldemort, the Ministry, anything. Hermione reached out and took his hand. I'm in, Harry. Whatever it takes. Ron nodded, his face serious. Me too. I always wanted to be part of something big. Harry felt the weight of their trust settle around him like a cloak. It was warm, heavy, and more precious than anything he'd ever owned. Good, he said. Then let's get to work. The first step was to understand the castle itself. Harry had explored Hogwarts extensively during his first year, but he'd barely scratched the surface. There were secrets buried in the ancient stones that no living person had uncovered, lost chambers, hidden passages, forgotten artifacts. And if he was going to build an empire, he needed to know every inch of his territory. He started with the library. Not the main library this time, but the restricted section and the hidden archives that weren't on any official map. He found records of the castle's construction, blueprints and diagrams that showed rooms that had been sealed off centuries ago. He discovered references to founders' vaults, hidden chambers where the 4 founders had supposedly stored their greatest treasures. The vaults were more than just legends. Harry found evidence of them in the castle's foundations, subtle anomalies in the magical architecture that hinted at spaces that shouldn't exist. He spent weeks mapping them, comparing his findings to old records and architectural plans. And then, one night in late September, he found something. It was tucked away in the dungeons, behind a wall that hadn't been opened in at least 500 years. Harry had been exploring the lower levels, following a thread of magical energy that pulsed faintly in the stone, when he found himself in a narrow corridor that ended in a blank wall. But it wasn't blank. It was a door. Harry pressed his hand against the stone and felt it vibrate with ancient magic. He whispered the words he'd found in an old text, asterisk, Aperir occultum, asterisk, and watched as the wall shimmered and parted, revealing a narrow passage that led down into darkness. He followed it for what felt like hours, his wand lighting the way. The passage twisted and turned, descending deeper into the earth than Harry had thought possible. And then, suddenly, it opened into a vast chamber. The room was circular, its walls lined with shelves that held thousands of books and scrolls. A fountain in the center flowed with water that seemed to glow with its own inner light. And on a pedestal in the corner sat a small, ornate chest. Harry approached the chest slowly, his heart pounding. He'd found it. One of the founders' vaults. And whatever was inside, it had been waiting for him for 500 years. He opened the chest with trembling hands. Inside lay a single book, bound in what looked like dragonhide. The title was embossed in gold, asterisk, The Art of Invisible Influence, a treatise on magical politics and information networks. Asterisk. Harry's breath caught. The book was ancient, older than anything he'd ever seen, and it was exactly what he needed. He sat down in the center of the chamber and began to read. The book changed everything. It was written by a wizard named Aldrich of the Shadows, a figure who'd apparently been so skilled at political manipulation that his very name had been erased from history. The book was his masterpiece, a comprehensive guide to building and maintaining power without anyone realizing you were doing it. Harry read it cover to cover, then read it again. The techniques were subtle, elegant, and devastatingly effective. They were about information, about trust, about the careful management of relationships and expectations. They were about building a network that was stronger than any army, more enduring than any institution. Harry started applying the techniques immediately. He began with the Ravenclaws. They were the easiest targets. They valued knowledge above all else, and Harry had access to more knowledge than anyone else in the school. He started by sharing information with them, interesting facts he'd discovered about the castle, ancient spells he'd found in the vault, historical details that contradicted what they were being taught in class. The Ravenclaws were intrigued. They wanted to know where he'd found this information. And when Harry offered to share more, in exchange for their own discoveries, their own insights, they agreed. The exchange wasn't overt. Harry made sure of that. He didn't call meetings or create formal structures. He simply made himself available, a reliable source of information that the Ravenclaws could turn to when they needed something. And in return, they started sharing their own knowledge. Not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Within a month, Harry had access to a network of Ravenclaw students who were feeding him information about everything from professors' secret research to families' political alliances. He knew which students were being pressured by their parents to join certain factions, which teachers had private grudges against each other, which families were on the verge of falling out of favor. The Hufflepuffs were next. They were harder to reach. They valued loyalty and community, not information, but Harry found another way. He started helping them. Small things, mostly, finding lost items, solving minor disputes, providing support when they needed it. He made himself indispensable, a quiet presence who could be counted on to help whenever they asked. The Hufflepuffs started trusting him. And trust, Harry knew, was the most valuable currency of all. By Christmas, Harry had built a web of relationships that spanned all 4 houses. He had friends in every corner of Hogwarts, people who would share information with him because they liked him, because they trusted him, because they saw him as someone who could help them. But he was careful. He never asked for anything directly. He never pressured anyone. He simply made himself available, created space for relationships to grow, and waited for people to come to him. It was slow work. Painstaking work. But Harry had learned patience in the cupboard under the stairs, and he was willing to wait as long as it took. The secret passages were another piece of the puzzle. Harry had always known that Hogwarts was full of hidden paths and forgotten tunnels. But as he explored the castle more systematically, he began to realize that the passages weren't just shortcuts. They were a network. A system of movement that allowed someone to get anywhere in the castle without being seen. He mapped them all. Every secret passage, every hidden room, every forgotten corridor. He found passages that led to Hogsmeade, to the Forbidden Forest, to places that weren't on any official map. He discovered rooms that had been sealed for centuries, chambers that held artifacts and knowledge that no one else had touched. And he started using them. He used the passages to move around the castle without being seen. He used them to deliver messages, to collect information, to meet with his growing network of allies. He used them to visit the restricted section of the library after hours, to explore the Founder's vaults without anyone knowing. The passages gave him freedom. They gave him power. And they gave him the ability to act without anyone knowing what he was doing. By the time spring arrived, Harry's network was vast and growing. He had contacts in every house, every year, every social group. He knew which students were being recruited by the Death Eaters, which families were supporting the Ministry, which teachers were secretly working against each other. He had access to information that no one else had, and he used it carefully, strategically, to protect himself and his allies. Hermione had become his research strategist, coordinating the network's information-gathering efforts. She was brilliant at organizing data, finding patterns, connecting dots that no one else could see. She created a sophisticated system of coded messages and hidden signals that allowed the network to communicate without anyone knowing. Ron had become his military strategist, analyzing threats and planning responses. He'd grown more serious over the year, more focused, more determined. He understood the stakes in a way that few others did, and he was determined to protect his family and friends no matter what. But there was another member of their group now, someone who joined their cause without fully understanding it. Neville Longbottom. Harry had noticed Neville during their first year, the shy, nervous boy who seemed to be afraid of everything. But he'd also noticed something else, Neville's determination. His courage. The way he'd stood up to the others when it mattered. So Harry had started talking to him. Quietly, casually, about small things at first. And then, gradually, about bigger things. About their families. About the war that had torn the wizarding world apart. About the people who'd been lost. Neville had opened up slowly, reluctantly. But when he did, Harry realized he was sitting on a gold mine. Neville's parents had been Aurors. They'd been tortured into insanity by Death Eaters. And Neville had grown up surrounded by people who were still fighting, still resisting, still trying to make sense of what had happened. He knew things, political things, strategic things, that nobody else in their year knew. "Your grandmother," Harry said one night, when they were sitting in the common room together. "She's still in contact with the old order, isn't she?" Neville's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Harry's voice was gentle. "I'm not going to hurt anyone, Neville. I'm not trying to expose anyone. I just want to understand. I want to know what we're up against." Neville stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "There are people who stayed in touch. People who never gave up. They have meetings sometimes. My gran goes to them." Harry leaned forward. "Can you get me in? Or at least get me information?" Neville hesitated. "I don't know. It's dangerous. If anyone found out..." "They won't. I'm good at keeping secrets, Neville. I've been doing it my whole life." Neville looked at him, his eyes searching for something. And then, slowly, he nodded again. I'll see what I can do. Harry smiled. Thank you, Neville. You're a good friend. Neville's face flushed with pleasure. I'm not. I don't think I'm. You are, Harry said firmly. Trust me. You're going to be one of the most important people in this fight. One day, everyone will know it. Neville didn't say anything. But Harry could see the change in his eyes, a new confidence, a new determination. He'd been touched by the same fire that burned in Harry, and he would never be the same. The second year brought new threats, new challenges. The Chamber of Secrets. The petrifications. The whispers of the heir of Slytherin. Harry knew, instinctively, intuitively, that Voldemort was behind it all. Or at least, one of his agents. The diary that had been found, the one that had possessed Ginny Weasley, was clearly connected to the Dark Lord. But Harry didn't rush into anything. He'd learned that lesson in his first year. Instead, he studied. He gathered information. He waited for the right moment to act. The diary was the key. Harry knew that the moment he saw it. It was an object of immense power, a repository of knowledge and malice that could teach him more about Voldemort than any book. But it was also dangerous, capable of corrupting anyone who used it. Harry didn't destroy it immediately. Instead, he took it to one of the Founder's vaults, to the room where he'd found Aldrich's treatise. He sat down with the diary and began to study it. The diary resisted him at first. It tried to possess him, to drain his energy, to open him up to the same dark influence that had claimed Ginny. But Harry was prepared. He'd been practicing occlumency, the art of defending the mind, and he'd become surprisingly good at it. He closed his mind to the diary, refusing to let it in, and instead studied it from a distance. He read its history. He traced its magic. He understood, slowly, that it was something more than just a diary. It was a fragment of Voldemort's soul. A Horcrux. Harry had heard of Horcruxes before, in the books he'd read, the ones that talked about the darkest magic. But he'd never imagined he'd see one. He'd never imagined they were real. He was careful with the diary. He didn't try to destroy it, not yet. Instead, he teased information out of it, drawing the memory of Tom Riddle into conversations that revealed more than it intended. He asked questions about the Chamber of Secrets, about the basilisk, about the connection between the diary and the Dark Lord. And the diary, arrogant, convinced that it was in control, answered. Harry learned about Horcruxes in detail. He learned how they were made, how they could be destroyed, what they meant for Voldemort's survival. He learned about the Chamber of Secrets, and the beast within it. He learned about the history of Salazar Slytherin, and the war he'd waged against Muggleborns. And he learned that Voldemort had made more than one Horcrux. Many more. Harry's blood ran cold. He'd always known Voldemort was powerful. But this was something else entirely. This was immortality, or something close to it. This was a threat that couldn't be met with spells or curses. This required a different approach. A strategic approach. He laid out the information for Hermione and Ron in one of their secret meetings, in a hidden room that none of the teachers knew about. He's made multiple Horcruxes, Harry said. I don't know how many, but at least 2. Maybe more. Destroying them is the only way to kill him. Blind, Ron breathed. How do we do that? I don't know yet. Harry's voice was steady, controlled. But I'm going to find out. I'm going to learn everything I can about Horcruxes, about their weaknesses, about how to destroy them. And I'm going to do it before Voldemort comes back. And the basilisk? Hermione asked. What about that? Harry smiled. I have a plan. But I'm going to need your help. The plan was simple in theory, complex in execution. Harry didn't want to fight the basilisk directly. That was what Voldemort wanted, a confrontation, a battle, a chance to test his strength against the boy who lived. Harry wasn't going to give him that chance. Instead, he was going to use the basilisk. He was going to turn it into a weapon against its own master. He started by studying the basilisk's weaknesses. The creature was ancient, powerful, nearly indestructible. But it had one vulnerability: its gaze could be reflected. And Harry had access to a mirror of Ariste. He worked with Hermione to create a plan. They would lure the basilisk into a chamber where the mirror was set up, reflect its own gaze back at it, and watch as it destroyed itself. But they needed a way to get the basilisk there. They needed a distraction. That's where Ron came in. Ron's knowledge of the chamber's layout, combined with Harry's expertise in the castle's hidden passages, allowed them to create a path that would lead the basilisk exactly where they wanted it to go. The night of the plan, everything was in place. Harry stood in the Chamber of Secrets, his wand raised, facing the massive snake that slithered toward him. Its eyes were huge, yellow, filled with ancient malice. But Harry didn't look at them. He looked at the mirror. "Come on," he whispered. "Just a little closer." The basilisk lunged. Harry dodged, rolling to the side, and watched as the creature's gaze met its own reflection. There was a shriek, a blinding light, and then the basilisk collapsed, its own power turned against it. Harry stood in the silence, his heart pounding. He'd done it. He'd defeated the basilisk without lifting a wand. Ginny was in the chamber too, pale and weak, barely conscious. Harry moved to her side, feeling her pulse. She was alive. They'd saved her. "We need to get you out of here," Harry said softly. "Come on. I've got you." Ginny opened her eyes, looking up at him with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Harry, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Harry said. "It wasn't your fault. You were being controlled. We'll talk about it later. Right now, we need to get you to the hospital wing." He helped her to her feet and began to lead her toward the exit. But he stopped at the entrance to the chamber and looked back. The diary was still lying in the corner, its pages open, its magic defeated. Harry walked over and picked it up. He could feel the residual energy, the faint pulse of the Horcrux that was no longer active. He'd destroyed the basilisk, but the diary was still intact. Still dangerous. Harry thought about destroying it. It would be easy, a simple spell, a moment of effort. But he hesitated. The diary had information. Information that he might need. Instead, he tucked it into his robes. He'd study it later, wring every last secret out of it, and destroy it when he was ready. "Harry," Ginny said weakly. "What are you doing?" "Making sure we don't make the same mistake twice," Harry said. "Come on. Let's go." They left the Chamber of Secrets behind, and Harry knew that the real war was just beginning. The network grew stronger over the summer. Harry spent his holidays at Grimmauld Place, the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix. It was the first time he'd been in the presence of so many people who were fighting against Voldemort, and the first time he'd been able to gather information from them directly. He listened to their conversations. He studied their behavior. He identified their weaknesses and their strengths. And he started to plan. The Order was brave, determined, and resourceful. But they were also fractured. They had different priorities, different approaches, different agendas. Some wanted to fight Voldemort directly. Others wanted to gather information. Some wanted to protect the innocent. Others wanted revenge. Harry understood that he needed to unify them. He needed to give them a common purpose, a shared strategy. But he couldn't do it openly. He had to do it in the shadows, quietly, subtly. He started with Sirius, his godfather. Sirius was passionate, loyal, and reckless. He wanted to protect Harry at all costs, and he was willing to do whatever it took. But he also had access to information that no one else had, information about the Death Eaters, about Voldemort's network, about the politics of the wizarding world. Harry cultivated Sirius carefully, giving him the support and validation he craved. He listened when Sirius talked, offered encouragement when he needed it, gently steered his attention toward the information that mattered. And as Sirius trusted him more, he started sharing things he'd never shared with anyone else. He started with Remus Lupin, the werewolf who'd been his teacher. Remus was careful, cautious, and deeply suspicious. He didn't trust anyone easily, and Harry respected that. He didn't push Remus for information. Instead, he offered help when it was needed, support when it was offered. He made himself useful, indispensable, and gradually, Remus started to open up. He started with the other members of the Order, offering what he could and asking for nothing in return. He helped with research, with reconnaissance, with planning. He was always there, always ready, always willing. And they started to trust him, to lean on him, to see him as someone who could be counted on. By the end of the summer, Harry had built a network that extended beyond Hogwarts. He had eyes and ears in the Ministry, in the Order, in the wizarding world at large. He had access to information that no one else had. And he was ready for the next phase of his plan. Third year was a turning point. The Sirius Black situation had proven to be more complicated than anyone had expected. Harry had been careful, working behind the scenes to protect his godfather while ensuring that justice was served. But the experience had taught him something important. The wizarding world's institutions were deeply flawed. The Ministry was corrupt. The justice system was broken. Even the Order had its blind spots. Harry knew he couldn't trust any of them. He had to build something of his own. Something that could survive anything. He started with the students. The network had grown beyond Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff. Now it included students from all houses, all years, all backgrounds. They were united by a common goal: survival. By the understanding that Voldemort was coming, and that they needed to be ready. Harry organized them quietly, carefully. He created communication channels that couldn't be traced. He set up training sessions that taught practical skills. He shared information about threats and dangers, about how to protect themselves and their families. He also started to uncover the secrets of the castles. Older vaults. The founders had hidden more than just knowledge. They'd hidden artifacts, powerful artifacts that could be used for good or ill. Harry found them, cataloged them, and secured them. He was building an arsenal that no one knew about. An arsenal that would help him win the war. By the end of the year, Harry had become something he never expected: a leader, a strategist, a force to be reckoned with. But Voldemort was still out there. Still planning. Still scheming. And Harry knew that the battle was just beginning. The night before the end of term, Harry stood in the astronomy tower, looking out over the grounds. The castle was peaceful, quiet, the same as it had always been. But Harry knew it was changing. He knew that everything was changing. "Harry?" He turned. Hermione was standing in the doorway, her face concerned. "You've been up here for hours," she said. "Is everything okay?" Harry nodded. "I'm fine. Just thinking." "About what?" "About what comes next." He gestured at the dark sky. "Voldemort is out there. He's getting stronger. And I need to be ready." Hermione moved to stand beside him. "We'll be ready," she said firmly. "All of us. Together." Harry looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and felt a surge of gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Hermione. You're the best friend I've ever had." She smiled. "You'd manage. You always do." She paused, then added, "I've been thinking about what you said. About the Horcruxes. I think I've found something. A way to destroy them. A specific way." Harry's heart raced. "What is it?" "It's called basilisk venom. It's one of the few things that can destroy a Horcrux. We used some to destroy the diary, remember?" Harry nodded slowly. "We still have some. In the Chamber of Secrets." "Yes. But I also found something else." Hermione pulled out a book from her robes. "There's an old spell, a very old spell, that can destroy Horcruxes permanently. It's called the Conflagratio Animarum. The burning of souls. It's dark magic, Harry. Very dark magic. But it works." Harry took the book from her, his hands trembling. He read the words on the page and felt a shiver run down his spine. The spell was dangerous, potentially lethal. But it was exactly what he needed. This could change everything. He breathed. I know. Hermione's voice was soft. That's why I brought it to you. Harry closed the book and looked at her. Thank you, Hermione. For everything. For trusting me. For standing by me. Hermione squeezed his hand. Always, Harry. Always. They stood together in the darkness, watching the stars wheel overhead. The war was coming. But Harry had never felt more ready. The school year ended, and Harry returned to Privet Drive. But he'd changed. He wasn't the same boy who'd left Hogwarts at the end of his second year. He'd grown stronger, wiser, more dangerous. He'd built an empire in the shadows, a network that was poised to change the world. And Voldemort still had no idea who he was dealing with. Harry lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, and smiled. The game was still in its early stages. There were many moves yet to be made. Many pieces still to be positioned. But he was ready. He'd been preparing for this his whole life. He reached for his journal and began to write. Plans. Strategies. Contingencies. He was building something that would outlast any war, any enemy, any threat. And when the time came, Harry Potter would be ready. The end of Chapter 2. #Outsmarting the Diary. #Chapter 3. The summer before his second year had been a turning point, but the summer before his third year was something else entirely. It was the summer Harry learned to truly see. Not with his eyes, though those had always been sharp enough, but with something deeper. Something that had been growing inside him since the moment he'd first opened Aldrich's treatise in the Founder's vault. The ability to look at a situation and understand not just what was happening, but why. To see the strings that connected people, events, and consequences. To recognize patterns that others missed. He spent the long, hot days in his room at Privet Drive, the door locked against the Dursleys' prying eyes, surrounded by books and scrolls and maps. The network had grown so large that he could no longer keep it all in his head. He needed systems. He needed structure. He needed to organize the chaos into something coherent. Hermione had sent him a coded system for tracking information, a complex web of symbols and references that allowed him to cross-reference data from dozens of sources. Ron had sent him a set of chess problems, each one representing a different strategic scenario. Neville had sent him a list of names, carefully compiled from his grandmother's contacts, of people who might be willing to help. Harry worked through it all, night after night, building his understanding of the wizarding world's hidden architecture. He knew which families were secretly supporting Voldemort. He knew which ministry officials were corrupt. He knew which members of the Order were trustworthy and which were compromised. He knew the weaknesses of the Auror Corps, the blind spots in the Department of Mysteries, the secret alliances that bound the pure-blood families together. But there was still so much he didn't know. So many secrets buried in the past. So many questions that had no answers. One question, in particular, haunted him: how had Voldemort survived? Not just the night he tried to kill Harry, that was well documented. But the years before. The years when he'd been building his power, gathering followers, creating the infrastructure that had allowed him to terrorize Britain for a decade. The answer, Harry suspected, lay in the Horcruxes. Those fragments of soul that Voldemort had hidden away, each one a piece of his immortality. Harry had destroyed one, the diary, the memory of Tom Riddle that had almost killed Ginny Weasley. But he knew there were others. He could feel them, somehow, like phantom limbs that still ached. He needed to find them. All of them. And he needed to destroy them before Voldemort could return. But that was a project for another day. For now, he needed to focus on the immediate future. On the next year at Hogwarts. On the threats that were already gathering in the shadows. The train ride to Hogwarts was uneventful, which Harry took as a bad sign. He sat in a compartment with Hermione and Ron, watching the countryside roll past, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges of the coming year. The network had expanded during the summer, new contacts, new sources of information, new alliances, but Harry knew that expansion brought risks. The more people who knew about the network, the more likely it was that someone would talk. "We need to be more careful this year," he said quietly. The network is getting too big. Too visible. We need to tighten security. Hermione nodded. I've been thinking about that. I've developed a new encryption system for our messages. It's based on ancient runes, so even if someone intercepts our communications, they won't be able to read them. Brilliant, Harry said. What about meetings? We can't keep using the same rooms. Someone's going to notice. Ron leaned forward. I've been exploring the castle again. I found a few more hidden passages. There's one that leads to a room behind the fourth-floor tapestry. It's completely sealed off. No one knows about it but me. Harry smiled. Good work, Ron. That's exactly what we need. The train rattled on, and Harry let himself relax slightly. His friends were with him. The network was strong. He had resources and allies and plans. Whatever the year brought, he was ready. The first sign that something was wrong came on the first day of classes. Harry was walking to potions with Ron, their books clutched against their chests, when he heard the whispers. They were everywhere, in the corridors, in the common rooms, in the great hall. Students huddled together, their faces pale and frightened, their voices low. Did you hear? There's been another attack. They're saying it's the heir of Slytherin. My cousin told me there was a message written on the wall in blood. Harry's blood ran cold. Not again. Not so soon. He cornered a third-year Ravenclaw he knew, a quiet girl named Padma, and asked her what had happened. It's the Chamber of Secrets, she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Someone opened it again. A student was attacked last night. A Muggleborn. She's in the hospital wing, but they don't know if she'll make it. Harry's mind raced. The Chamber of Secrets had been opened during his second year, but he'd thought he'd stopped it. He'd destroyed the diary, killed the basilisk, saved Ginny. How could it be happening again? Unless Voldemort had other ways. Other servants. Other agents. Harry's hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, where he carried a small, folded piece of parchment, the diary's remaining page, the one he'd saved for study. He'd been careful with it, locking it away in a warded box when he wasn't examining it. But maybe he hadn't been careful enough. Maybe the diary had left a residue of magic behind, a trace that someone else had found. He spent the next week gathering information. He talked to everyone in his network, asked them to report anything unusual. He visited the hospital wing, pretending to check on the victim, and examined the traces of dark magic that lingered around her bed. He searched the castle for signs of the heir's movements, looking for clues that no one else had noticed. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. The attacks were linked. Not just by their timing or their victims, but by something deeper. A pattern. A signature. The magic used was dark, ancient, and deeply tied to the legacy of Salazar Slytherin. But there was something else, too. Something that didn't quite fit. The attacks seemed almost opportunistic, as if whoever was behind them was taking advantage of the chaos rather than driving it. As if they had a different agenda than the one they were showing the world. Harry filed that observation away for later. It was a thread. He'd pull on it when the time was right. The diary was the key. Harry knew that now. He'd found it in the Chamber of Secrets, after destroying the basilisk. The diary had been damaged. The basilisk venom had eaten through its pages, leaving it cracked and leaking dark magic. But it was still intact enough to study. Still full of secrets waiting to be unlocked. Harry had been studying it for months, working slowly and carefully. The diary was dangerous, even in its damaged state. It still contained the memory of Tom Riddle, and that memory was hungry. It wanted to possess, to corrupt, to destroy. Harry had learned to approach it the way he approached everything else, with caution, patience, and respect for its power. He set up a small laboratory in one of the hidden rooms behind the fourth-floor tapestry. He surrounded it with protective wards, ones he'd learned from Aldrich's treatise and reinforced with his own knowledge. He brought the diary there, along with books and scrolls and the tools he needed for his research. And then he began to work. The first step was to understand the diary's nature. It was a Horcrux, that much Harry had confirmed. It contained a fragment of Voldemort's soul, preserved and protected by dark magic. The fragment was capable of independent thought and action, which was why it had been able to possess Ginny Weasley. But the fragment wasn't Voldemort himself. It was a memory, a copy, a preserved moment from the past. It had its own agenda, its own priorities, its own weaknesses. Harry's goal was to extract as much information from the memory as possible without being corrupted by it. He had to walk a narrow line, pushing the memory to reveal its secrets, while keeping his own mind protected. He started with simple questions. Who was Tom Riddle? Where had he come from? How had he become Voldemort? The memory was proud, arrogant, eager to share its achievements. It told Harry about its childhood in a Muggle orphanage, about its discovery of magic, about its time at Hogwarts. Harry listened carefully. He took notes. He compared the memory's accounts to historical records, looking for inconsistencies. And he found them. You say you were the last heir of Slytherin, Harry said one night. But the Slytherin line died out centuries ago. How is that possible? The memory smiled. It was a thin, cruel smile. The Slytherin line didn't die out, Potter. It went underground. It hid, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I am the culmination of that waiting. The fulfillment of that prophecy. What prophecy? The memory's smile widened. The prophecy that the heir of Slytherin would rise again. That they would purge Hogwarts of the unworthy. That they would restore the school to its former glory. Harry felt a chill run down his spine. You're talking about the Chamber of Secrets. You opened it. I was the last to open it, the memory said. But I won't be the last. There are others who carry my legacy. Others who will continue my work. Harry filed that information away. There were others. Other Death Eaters, other followers, other servants. Voldemort's network was bigger than he'd realized. Bigger and more dangerous. What happened to you? Harry asked. After Hogwarts. You became Voldemort. How? The memory's expression darkened. I became what I was always meant to be. The greatest wizard of my age. The one who would bring order to a world that had lost its way. But you were defeated, Harry said. You tried to kill me and failed. How does that fit into your grand plan? The memory's eyes flashed with rage. That was a mistake. A miscalculation. I underestimated the power of Lily Potter's sacrifice. But I won't make that mistake again. When I return, I'll be stronger than ever. And no one will stop me. Harry studied the memory's face, looking for signs of deception. But there was no deception there, only certainty. Voldemort truly believed he would return. He truly believed he would triumph. And that certainty, Harry realized, was his greatest weakness. He couldn't conceive of failure. He couldn't imagine losing. And that blind spot would be Harry's advantage. The diary revealed more secrets over the following weeks. Harry learned about Horcruxes in excruciating detail, how they were created, how they were hidden, how they could be destroyed. He learned about the Chamber of Secrets and its history, about the basilisk that had been its guardian. He learned about the Slytherin family and their legacy, about the power they'd wielded and the enemies they'd made. But he also learned about Voldemort himself. The memory was eager to talk about its creator, to share the details of his rise to power. It told Harry about the Knights of Walpurgis, the early followers who'd helped Voldemort build his network. It told him about the wars, the battles, the victories. It told him about the prophecy that had led Voldemort to hunt down Harry's parents. The prophecy was given by Sybil Trelawney, a descendant of Cassandra Trelawney. The memory said, its voice low and secretive. It said that the Dark Lord would be defeated by one born as the seventh month dies. One with power he knows not. The Dark Lord heard only part of the prophecy, the part about his defeat. He never heard the rest. Harry leaned forward. What was the rest? The memory smiled. That's the question, isn't it? That's the secret the Dark Lord has been trying to uncover for years. The prophecy was broken, shattered before it could be completed. Only the full prophecy holds the key to understanding how the Dark Lord can be defeated. Harry's mind raced. The prophecy. That was what Voldemort had been. That was what had driven him to kill Harry's parents. But if Voldemort didn't know the full prophecy, then he was operating in the dark. And that gave Harry an opening. "Where is the prophecy?" Harry asked. "Is it still intact?" The memory's face twisted with something that might have been envy. "It's in the Department of Mysteries. Protected by the Ministry. They don't know what they're holding, they don't understand its power. But the Dark Lord knows. He's been trying to get his hands on it for years." Harry filed that information away. The Department of Mysteries. He'd have to find a way to get in there, to find the prophecy, to understand what it said. But that was a project for another day. For now, he had more pressing concerns. The attacks continued throughout the autumn, casting a pall of fear over Hogwarts. Harry watched from his hidden vantage points, gathering information, connecting dots. He learned that the attacks were being carried out by a basilisk, just as during his second year. But he also learned that the basilisk was being controlled by someone else. Someone who wasn't acting directly, but was using the creature to advance their own agenda. The heir of Slytherin was a puppet. And the puppeteer was someone Harry hadn't expected. Lucius Malfoy. The connection came to Harry through his network. A Ravenclaw whose father worked in the Ministry had heard whispers about Lucius Malfoy's involvement in suspicious activities. A Hufflepuff whose cousin was a Death Eater had reported that Malfoy had been seen meeting with unknown individuals in Knockturn Alley. A Slytherin who'd fallen out with the Malfoy family had shared details of their hidden vaults and secret correspondences. Harry pieced it all together. Lucius Malfoy had somehow obtained the diary, the same diary Harry had destroyed, and had slipped it to Ginny Weasley in an attempt to discredit the Weasley family. But he'd been using the diary as a tool, a weapon. He hadn't understood what it really was. And now, the diary was damaged, but its influence remained. The magic that had created the basilisk was still active, still threatening the school. Harry knew he had to act. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Harry would use the diary's remaining power to draw out the basilisk. He would lure it into the Chamber of Secrets, where he'd already set up his defenses. And then he would destroy it, once and for all. But he needed help. Not from his friends. They would only get in the way, become distractions, risk themselves unnecessarily. No, he needed help from someone who could be trusted to follow orders and stay out of the line of fire. He needed Ginny Weasley. Harry found her in the common room one evening, her face pale and drawn. She'd been struggling since the summer, haunted by what she'd done while under the diary's influence. Harry knew she would blame herself, even though it wasn't her fault. "Ginny," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you. It's important." Ginny looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Harry? What is it? Is something wrong? I need your help. Something I can't do alone." She nodded, her expression shifting from fear to determination. "Anything, Harry. Whatever you need." Harry explained the plan quickly and quietly, watching Ginny's face as she processed the information. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She simply nodded and said, "When do we start?" "Now," Harry said. "The moon is right. The basilisk will be active tonight." The Chamber of Secrets was dark, cold, and filled with echoes. Harry moved through it carefully, his wand raised, listening for the sound of scales scraping against stone. Ginny walked beside him, her face pale but determined, clutching a small mirror that Harry had given her. "The basilisk is blind," Harry whispered. "It sees through its victim's eyes. If we don't look directly at it, we'll be safe." Ginny nodded. "I remember. From before." Harry could feel the diary pulsing in his pocket, the fragment of Voldemort's soul struggling to break free. He'd lured the basilisk here by tapping into the diary's power, using it as a beacon to draw the creature closer. And now, it was working. The basilisk emerged from the darkness, massive and terrifying. Its scales shimmered in the dim light, and its forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air. Harry didn't look at it. He kept his eyes down, focusing on the mirror he'd positioned in the center of the chamber. He'd set it up carefully, angling it so that the basilisk would see its own reflection. "No," he whispered to Ginny. "Step back. Let it come to us." The basilisk lunged, its huge body coiling as it struck. But Harry had already moved, pulling Ginny out of the way. The creature's eyes met the mirror, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the basilisk screamed. It was a terrible sound, high and piercing, as the creature's own gaze was reflected back at it. The basilisk writhed, its massive body twisting in agony as its own power turned against it. Harry watched, his heart pounding, as the creature's scales began to smoke and crack. He knew the effect wouldn't last long. The basilisk would soon realize what was happening and break free of the mirror's influence. He needed to act fast. He pulled out a vial of basilisk venom, the same venom he'd saved from his first encounter with the creature, and threw it at the basilisk's eyes. The venom splashed across the creature's face, and the basilisk let out another, even more terrible scream. "Now, Ginny!" Harry shouted. "The sword!" Ginny moved faster than Harry had ever seen her move. She grabbed the sword of Godric Gryffindor, the same sword that had been used to destroy the diary, and plunged it into the basilisk's heart. The basilisk shuddered once, twice, and then collapsed to the ground, dead. Harry stood in the silence, his breathing ragged, his heart pounding. He'd done it. He'd destroyed the basilisk once and for all. But the diary's influence was still there. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that had been imprisoned in the book was now free, searching for a new vessel. Harry felt it reach out to him, felt the temptation to let it in. The diary promised power, knowledge, the secrets of the Dark Lord himself. It promised Harry everything he'd ever wanted. But Harry had spent his entire life being tempted by things that looked too good to be true. He knew better. He knew that power came with a price, and that the diary's price was his soul. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the diary's remaining page, and held it up. The fragment of Voldemort's soul screamed as Harry set the page ablaze with a single, whispered word. The fire consumed the page, and with it, the remaining trace of the diary's magic. The fragment of Voldemort's soul shrieked one last time and then was gone. Harry dropped the page to the ground, watching as it crumbled to ash. He felt lighter than he had in months. The diary's influence was gone. The basilisk was gone. And Voldemort had lost another piece of his immortality. "Are you okay?" Ginny asked, her voice trembling. Harry nodded. "I'm fine. And so are you." Ginny looked down at the basilisk, her face pale. "It's dead. It's really dead." "Yes," Harry said. "And it's never coming back." The days that followed were quiet. Harry didn't tell anyone what had happened in the Chamber of Secrets. He didn't want the attention, the questions, the well-meaning interference. He simply went about his business, studying, working with his network, preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. The attacks at Hogwarts stopped. The heir of Slytherin was never identified, and the Ministry eventually concluded that the threat had passed. Students returned to their normal routines, the fear of the previous months gradually fading. But Harry didn't forget. He couldn't forget. He'd seen too much. He'd learned too much. He spent his evenings in the hidden room behind the fourth-floor tapestry, studying the Horcruxes. He'd destroyed 2 of them now, the diary and the basilisk. But he knew there were more. So many more. Each one a fragment of Voldemort's soul, each one a piece of his immortality. Harry started making a list. He didn't know how many Horcruxes there were, but he suspected at least 6. Possibly more. He wrote down everything he'd learned from the diary, the locations, the protections, the secrets. He cross-referenced it with information from his network, with books from the restricted section, with his own research. Slowly, painfully, a pattern began to emerge. The Horcruxes were hidden in places that were important to Voldemort. Places that held meaning, that represented power, that were tied to his past. The diary, for example, had been hidden in the Chamber of Secrets, where Voldemort had once unlocked the secrets of Slytherin. The basilisk had been hidden beneath the castle, where it had guarded the chamber for centuries. Harry started to think like Voldemort. He put himself in the Dark Lord's mind, trying to understand how he thought, what he valued, where he would hide his most precious possessions. And slowly, he began to see the shape of the puzzle. The Horcruxes weren't just random objects. They were a map. A map of Voldemort's soul, of his history, of his greatest sins. The school year ended, and Harry returned to Privet Drive. But he wasn't the same boy who'd left at the start of the year. He'd grown stronger, wiser, more dangerous. He'd destroyed 2 Horcruxes. He'd learned the secrets of Voldemort's past. He'd built a network that was stronger than ever. And he'd begun to plan. Lying in his bed at Privet Drive, Harry stared at the ceiling and thought about the war. Voldemort was still out there, still plotting, still gathering his strength. But Harry was making progress. He was moving faster than anyone else. He was learning more than anyone else. He reached for his journal and began to write. Plans, strategies, contingencies. He had to destroy the other Horcruxes. He had to understand the prophecy. He had to prepare for the coming war. And he had to do it all in the shadows. Without anyone knowing. Without anyone stopping him. Harry wrote late into the night, his pen scratching against the paper. The war was coming. But Harry would be ready. The summer that followed was the busiest of Harry's life. He spent his days in the library at Little Whinging, reading everything he could find about Horcruxes, about dark magic, about the history of the wizarding world. He spent his nights in his room, analyzing the information, connecting the dots, building his understanding of Voldemort's network. The network had grown during the school year, expanding beyond Hogwarts to include contacts in the Ministry, in the Order, in the wizarding world at large. Harry now had access to information that no one else had. He knew the secrets of the pureblood families, the hidden alliances, the buried crimes. He used that information carefully, strategically. He manipulated events, guided decisions, shaped outcomes. He was playing a game of chess with the entire wizarding world as his board, and he was winning. But Voldemort was still out there. Still plotting. Still growing stronger. Harry knew he needed to act. He needed to destroy the Horcruxes. He needed to stop Voldemort before he could return. And he needed to do it soon. The first Horcrux was the easiest. It was a locket, hidden in a cave on the coast of England. Harry found it after weeks of research, tracing Voldemort's steps through the records of his youth. The cave was dark, cold, and filled with traps. Harry had to fight through inferi, through enchanted water, through the protections Voldemort had placed around his most precious possession. But he made it through, and he found the locket, and he destroyed it with a single, whispered word. The second Horcrux was harder. It was a ring, hidden in the ruins of the Gaunt family home. Harry had to travel there in secret, avoiding the wards that Voldemort had placed around the property. He found the ring, and he destroyed it, but not before it tried to corrupt him. He felt the dark magic clawing at his mind, felt the temptation to use the ring's power. But he resisted, and he destroyed it, and he walked away. The third Horcrux was a diadem. It was hidden in the room of requirement at Hogwarts, where Harry had been searching for months. He found it eventually, a tarnished, ancient thing, buried beneath a pile of forgotten objects. He destroyed it with the basilisk venom he'd saved from the Chamber of Secrets, and he felt Voldemort's power diminish once more. The fourth Horcrux was a cup. It was hidden in a vault in Gringotts, protected by the most powerful wizards in the wizarding world. Harry spent months planning the heist, gathering the resources he needed. He finally succeeded in the spring of his 4th year, breaking into Gringotts with the help of his network, and walking away with the cup. The fifth Horcrux was a snake. Nagini, Voldemort's familiar. Harry found her in the summer after his 4th year, in a remote location where Voldemort was hiding. He killed her with the sword of Godric Gryffindor, the same sword he'd used to destroy the basilisk. He felt Voldemort's power shatter, felt the connection between them weaken. One Horcrux remained. The one Voldemort had never intended to make. The one that was hidden in Harry himself. Harry stood in the hidden room behind the fourth-floor tapestry, staring at the small, folded piece of parchment that held his fate. The final Horcrux. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that lived inside him. He'd known about it for months. He'd felt it, the presence of Voldemort's magic wrapped around his own. He'd always known there was something different about him, something that set him apart from other people. Now he knew what it was. He had to destroy it. He had to remove the Horcrux from his own soul. But he didn't know how. He didn't know if it was even possible. Hermione found him there, late one night, her face concerned. "Harry? What are you doing?" Harry looked up, his eyes tired and haunted. "I found the last Horcrux." Hermione's face went pale. "Where is it?" "Here," Harry said, touching his chest. "Inside me." Hermione's eyes widened. "No. That's not possible." "I'm afraid it is. Voldemort made a Horcrux without meaning to. When he tried to kill me, a piece of his soul broke off and attached itself to mine. It's been there ever since." Hermione sank into a chair, her face white. "How do we destroy it? How do we remove it without killing you?" Harry shook his head. "I don't know. But I'm going to find out. I have to." Hermione reached out and took his hand. "We'll find a way. Together. I promise you, Harry. We'll find a way." Harry nodded, but he didn't believe it. He knew deep down that destroying the Horcrux would mean destroying himself. He'd already made peace with that. He'd accepted it. But he wasn't going to tell Hermione that. Not yet. There was still time. There was still work to do. And Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the greatest strategist in magical history, was not going to give up without a fight. The end of Chapter 3. #The hunt begins before Voldemort. #Chapter 4. The summer after his 4th year was the longest and darkest of Harry's life. He knew what he had to do. The Horcrux inside him had to be destroyed. But the knowledge of what that would cost, what it would mean, sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. He couldn't tell anyone. Not Hermione, not Ron, not Sirius. They would try to stop him. They would try to find another way. And there was no other way. Harry had spent months searching, researching, consulting every source he could find. The only way to destroy a Horcrux was to destroy its vessel. And the vessel was him. He lay in his bed at Privet Drive, staring at the ceiling, and made his peace with it. He would die. But he would die having accomplished something. He would die having destroyed Voldemort. He would die having protected the people he loved. It wasn't a bad way to go. But first he had work to do. The Horcruxes were only half the battle. He still needed to understand Voldemort's network, his plans, his weaknesses. He still needed to prepare the wizarding world for the coming war. He still needed to ensure that his death meant something. The network had grown during the school year, expanding beyond anything Harry had imagined. He now had contacts in every corner of the wizarding world, in the Ministry, in the Order, in the pure-blood families, in the underground resistance movements. He had access to information that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. And he was using that information ruthlessly. The first piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source, Draco Malfoy. Harry had always known that Draco was more than just a bully. The Malfoy family had been Death Eaters, and Draco had grown up surrounded by their ideology. He'd been raised to believe in pure blood supremacy, to despise Muggleborns, to worship Voldemort. But Harry had also noticed something else. Draco was afraid. Not of Harry, not of his enemies, but of his father. Of the expectations placed on him. Of the life he was being forced into. Harry had cultivated Draco carefully, working through intermediaries in Slytherin House. He'd never approached Draco directly. That would have been too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, he'd used the network to plant seeds of doubt in Draco's mind. He'd arranged for Draco to hear whispers about his father's failures, about the weakness of the Death Eater cause, about the alternatives that existed. Slowly, over the course of a year, Draco had begun to change. He'd started questioning his father's decisions. He'd started looking at his classmates with new eyes. He'd started to wonder if there was another path. And now, in the summer after Harry's 4th year, Draco had finally reached out. Harry received the message through one of his Slytherin contacts, a coded letter that had been smuggled out of Malfa Manor. It was short, cryptic, and terrifying. Asterisk. My father is planning something. He's meeting with the Dark Lord's followers. They're talking about a weapon, something that will change the war. I don't know what it is, but I know it's important. I know it's dangerous. Please, you have to stop them. Asterisk. Harry read the letter 3 times, his mind racing. A weapon. Something that would change the war. That could only mean one thing: Voldemort was planning to return. And he was going to do it soon. Harry wrote back immediately, using the same coded system that Draco had used. Asterisk. Tell me everything. Where are the meetings? Who is attending? What do you know about the weapon? Asterisk. The reply came a week later. It was longer this time, more detailed. Draco had been listening carefully, gathering information from his father's conversations. He'd learned that Voldemort was planning to use a ritual to return to power, a ritual that required the blood of his enemies, the flesh of his servants, and a powerful magical artifact. The artifact, Draco wrote, was the most important part. It was called the Resurrection Stone, and it was said to have the power to bring the dead back to life. Voldemort believed that with the stone, he could not only return to his own body but also raise an army of the dead to fight for him. Harry's blood ran cold. The Resurrection Stone. He'd heard of it, of course. It was one of the Deathly Hallows, the legendary artifacts that had been created by death itself. But he'd never imagined that Voldemort would find it. That he would use it. He needed to stop this. He needed to find the Resurrection Stone before Voldemort did. And he needed to destroy the ritual that Voldemort was planning. But how? The network was the key. Harry mobilized his contacts, sending out coded messages across the wizarding world. He needed information about the Resurrection Stone, where it was, who had it, how to find it. He needed information about Voldemort's ritual, what it required, how it worked, how to disrupt it. The answers came slowly, piece by piece. The Resurrection Stone, Harry learned, had been lost for centuries. It had last been seen in the possession of the Peverell family, an ancient line of wizards who had supposedly created the Deathly Hallows. The Peverells had died out long ago, but their legacy had survived, in the form of the stone, hidden somewhere in the wizarding world. Harry's network traced the stone's history. It had passed through various hands over the centuries, each owner keeping it secret, hiding it from those who would misuse it. The last known owner had been a wizard named Marvolo Gaunt, Voldemort's maternal grandfather. Harry's heart sank. The stone was in the Gaunt family's possession, which meant Voldemort already knew where it was. He'd probably known for years. But there was hope. The Gaunt family had fallen into obscurity, their wealth and power long since dissipated. The stone was hidden somewhere on their old property, forgotten and unprotected. Voldemort might not have been able to retrieve it yet, for reasons Harry didn't understand. He needed to get there first. The journey to the Gaunt family home was long and dangerous. Harry traveled in secret, using the network's resources to avoid detection. He took Muggle transport where possible, magical transport where necessary, always watching over his shoulder for signs of pursuit. He was alone this time. He couldn't risk involving anyone else. If Voldemort discovered what he was doing, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Gaunt family home was a ruin, overgrown and crumbling. Harry could feel the dark magic that lingered there, the residue of centuries of hatred and violence. He moved carefully, his wand raised, searching for any sign of the stone. He found it in the basement, hidden beneath a floorboard. The Resurrection Stone was small, unassuming, a black stone with a strange symbol carved into it. Harry picked it up carefully, feeling the power that pulsed through it. It was real. He'd found it. But now he had a choice. He could destroy the stone, ensuring that Voldemort never used it. Or he could keep it, use it himself, find a way to turn its power against the Dark Lord. Harry thought about it for a long moment. The stone had the power to raise the dead. That was a terrible power, one that could easily be corrupted. But it was also a power that might be useful. A power that might help him win the war. He tucked the stone into his pocket. He'd decide what to do with it later. For now, he needed to focus on the ritual. He needed to stop Voldemort from returning. The ritual was the most complex piece of magic Harry had ever encountered. He'd spent months studying it, piecing together the components from fragments of information gathered by his network. The ritual required the blood of the Dark Lord's enemy, the flesh of his servant, and the bone of his father. It required a cauldron of dark magic, a circle of ancient power, and a specific alignment of the stars. Harry knew where Voldemort would perform the ritual. It would be in the graveyard of Little Hangleton, where Voldemort's father was buried. The same graveyard where Voldemort had almost returned in Harry's 4th year. But Harry had learned from his mistakes. He wasn't going to let Voldemort complete the ritual this time. He was going to disrupt it. He was going to weaken it. He was going to make sure that when Voldemort returned, he returned weaker than he'd ever been. The plan was simple in theory, complex in execution. Harry would infiltrate the graveyard before the ritual began. He would replace the bone of Voldemort's father with a fake, rendering the ritual useless. He would sabotage the cauldron, making it impossible for the dark magic to take hold. He would protect the ritual site, ensuring that no one could interfere. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. And he knew exactly who to ask. Sirius Black was waiting for him in the Order's safe house, his face etched with concern. "Harry, what are you doing? You're supposed to be at the Dursleys. You're supposed to be safe." Harry shook his head. "There's no time for safe, Sirius. Voldemort is planning to return. He's going to perform the ritual in the graveyard at Little Hangleton. I need to stop him." Sirius's face went pale. "You can't go there alone. It's too dangerous." "I know. That's why I'm asking for your help." Sirius stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "What do you need?" Harry explained the plan. He needed Sirius to create a diversion, to draw Voldemort's followers away from the ritual site. He needed Sirius to protect the perimeter, to ensure that no one interfered. He needed Sirius to be his backup, his support, his ally. "I'll do it," Sirius said. "But Harry, if anything happens to you..." "Nothing's going to happen to me. I've been planning this for months. I know what I'm doing." Sirius didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "Fine. When do we leave?" "Tonight," Harry said. "The ritual is scheduled for the next full moon. We don't have much time." The night of the full moon was cold and clear. Harry and Sirius moved through the darkness, their wands raised, their eyes scanning for threats. The graveyard of Little Hangleton was quiet, peaceful, the headstones casting long shadows in the moonlight. Harry had been here before. He'd seen this place in his nightmares, in his visions. He knew every stone, every tree, every shadow. He moved with purpose, heading straight for the tomb of Tom Riddle Sr. The ritual site was set up in a clearing near the grave. Harry could see the cauldron, the circle of dark magic, the bones of Voldemort's father lying on a stone altar. He could feel the power gathering, the dark energy building. He moved quickly, replacing the bone with a fake he'd prepared. He sabotaged the cauldron, pouring a potion into it that would neutralize the dark magic. He laid protective wards around the site, ensuring that no one could interfere. And then he waited. The Death Eaters arrived first, their masks gleaming in the moonlight. Harry watched from his hidden position, counting them, identifying them. They were all there: Lucius Malfoy, Bellatrix Lestrange, Peter Pettigrew. The inner circle, the ones Voldemort trusted most. Harry's heart pounded as they began the ritual. He could feel the dark magic building, the energy rising. But he'd prepared for this. He'd planned for this. The ritual began, and Harry watched as the Death Eaters chanted, as the dark magic swirled around them. He felt the power surge, felt Voldemort's presence growing stronger. But then something went wrong. The cauldron cracked, spilling the dark magic onto the ground. The bone of Voldemort's father crumbled to dust. The ritual failed. The Death Eaters screamed in rage and frustration. Voldemort's presence faded, leaving behind only the echoes of his anger. Harry smiled. He'd done it. He'd disrupted the ritual. He'd weakened Voldemort. But the war was far from over. The months that followed were a blur of activity. Harry moved through the wizarding world like a ghost, gathering information, building alliances, preparing for the coming war. He destroyed more Horcruxes, each one weakening Voldemort further. He built his network, expanding it beyond anything he'd ever imagined. He trained, he studied, he planned. And slowly, Voldemort began to realize that something was wrong. His plans were failing. His followers were being arrested. His Horcruxes were being destroyed. He didn't know who was responsible, couldn't imagine that it was Harry Potter, the boy he'd dismissed as weak and foolish. But he knew that someone was working against him. Someone was defeating him. Harry felt Voldemort's confusion and frustration through their connection. He felt the Dark Lord's rage, his desperation, his growing fear. It was satisfying, in a dark way. Voldemort was finally getting a taste of his own medicine. But Harry also knew that Voldemort wouldn't give up. He was too stubborn, too ambitious. He would find another way. He would regroup, rebuild, return. And when he did, Harry would be ready. The Ministry was the next battleground. Harry had been working to expose the corruption within the Ministry for years. He'd gathered evidence, identified the corrupt officials, documented their crimes. Now it was time to act. He leaked the information through his network, watching as the Ministry crumbled from within. Aurors were arrested, officials were forced to resign, the entire institution was thrown into chaos. Harry didn't stop there. He also leaked evidence of corruption within the pureblood families, exposing their secrets, their alliances, their crimes. The public was outraged. The wizarding world was in turmoil. And Voldemort lost another advantage. Harry watched the chaos with satisfaction. He was winning. Not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small victories. Each one weakening Voldemort, strengthening Harry's position. But the war was far from over. The night before his 5th year at Hogwarts, Harry stood in his room at Privet Drive and looked at himself in the mirror. He was different now. Older, harder, more dangerous. The boy who'd gone to Hogwarts as a frightened, uncertain child was gone. In his place stood a young man who'd seen too much, done too much, lost too much. He touched his scar. It was still there, still aching, still connecting him to Voldemort. But it was weaker now. The Horcruxes were almost gone. Voldemort's power was fading. Harry smiled. He was going to win. He was going to destroy Voldemort once and for all. But first, he had one more Horcrux to destroy. The most important one. The one that lived inside him. He looked at his reflection and thought about what that would mean. He thought about Hermione, about Ron, about Sirius. He thought about the friends he'd made, the battles he'd won, the sacrifices he'd made. He thought about his parents, who died to save him. He thought about the future. About the world he was trying to create. About the people who would live in it after he was gone. And he decided that it was worth it. It was all worth it. Harry turned away from the mirror and began to prepare. The hunt for the final Horcrux began in earnest. Harry had been searching for a way to destroy the Horcrux inside him for months. He'd consulted every source he could find, asked every expert he could reach. The answer was always the same: the only way to destroy a Horcrux was to destroy its vessel. But Harry was stubborn. He refused to accept that. There had to be another way. There had to be a way to remove the Horcrux without dying. And then, in the depths of the winter, he found it. The answer came from an unlikely source, a book on ancient Egyptian magic that Hermione had found in the restricted section. The book described a ritual that could separate a soul from its vessel, a ritual that had been used centuries ago to remove dark magic from cursed objects. Harry read the ritual carefully, studying every word. It was dangerous, potentially fatal. But it was also the only chance he had. He needed to perform the ritual on himself. He needed to separate Voldemort's soul from his own. He needed to destroy the Horcrux without destroying himself. It was a risk. A huge risk. But Harry had been taking risks his whole life. It was the only way he knew how to live. The ritual required a specific alignment of the stars, a specific combination of magical artifacts, and a specific state of mind. Harry had everything he needed. He'd been preparing for months. He performed the ritual in the hidden room behind the 4th floor. Tapestry, surrounded by protective wards and the artifacts he'd gathered. He sat in the center of a circle, chanting the ancient words, focusing his mind on the Horcrux inside him. He could feel it resisting. He could feel Voldemort's soul fighting back, trying to maintain its hold on him. But Harry was stronger now. He'd been training for this moment his whole life. He pushed through the pain, through the fear, through the doubt. He felt the Horcrux tearing away from him, felt it screaming as it was torn from its vessel. And then, with a final, terrible effort, Harry separated the Horcrux from his soul. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. He was alive. He'd done it. He'd destroyed the Horcrux without dying. He looked at the small, black object that had been the Horcrux, a tiny fragment of Voldemort's soul, now separated and powerless. Harry picked it up and crushed it in his hand. The Horcrux was gone. All of them were gone. Harry smiled. He'd won. He'd beaten Voldemort. He'd destroyed every single Horcrux. But the war was far from over. Voldemort was still out there, still desperate, still dangerous. And Harry needed to be ready for whatever came next. The day of the final confrontation arrived sooner than Harry expected. He'd been planning for months, preparing for every possibility. But when the moment came, it was still a shock. Voldemort had found a way to return, despite everything Harry had done. He'd used a different ritual, a different method. And now he was back, stronger than ever. Harry met him on the battlefield, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen. The Battle of Hogwarts. The final confrontation. Voldemort looked at him with eyes that burned with hatred. "Potter," he hissed. "You have destroyed everything I've built. You've taken everything from me." Harry met his gaze calmly. "You started this, Voldemort. You killed my parents. You tried to kill me. I'm just finishing what you started." Voldemort laughed. "You think you can defeat me? You're nothing. A boy playing at being a wizard. You don't have the power to destroy me." Harry smiled. "I don't need power. I need intelligence. And I've been outsmarting you from the beginning." He raised his wand and faced Voldemort. The Dark Lord raised his wand too, and for a moment they stood frozen, the tension between them unbearable. Then Harry spoke. "The Horcruxes are gone, Voldemort. All of them. The diary, the locket, the ring, the diadem, the cup, the snake. Every single one. You're mortal now. You can be killed." Voldemort's face went white with rage. "You lie." "I don't lie. I've been planning this for years. I've been destroying your Horcruxes one by one, weakening you, making you vulnerable. And now it's finally over." Voldemort screamed and lunged. Harry dodged and raised his wand. The curses flew between them, spells of light and dark, of power and desperation. Harry felt the battle raging around him, but he kept his focus. He kept his calm. He'd planned for this. He'd prepared for it. He knew exactly what to do. He waited for his moment. He watched Voldemort, studied his movements, his rhythm. And then, when the Dark Lord made the mistake he'd been waiting for, Harry struck. The spell was simple, a disarming charm, the same one he'd used in his first year. But it was backed by years of practice, years of training, years of preparation. It flew from his wand, fast and true, and struck Voldemort in the chest. The Dark Lord collapsed, his wand flying from his hand. He lay on the ground, gasping, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "It's over, Voldemort," Harry said quietly. You've lost. Voldemort looked up at him, his face twisted with hatred. And then, slowly, he began to fade. His body dissolved into ash, his soul shattering into nothing. The war was over. Voldemort was gone. Harry stood in the silence, his heart pounding, his body aching. The battle was over. He'd won. He'd actually won. He looked around at the faces of his friends, his allies, his enemies. They were all staring at him, their eyes wide with shock and awe. He'd done it. He'd defeated Voldemort. He'd saved the wizarding world. But Harry knew that wasn't the end. The war might be over, but the work would continue. The healing, the rebuilding, the creating of a new world. And he would be there for all of it. He would never stop. He would never give up. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the greatest strategist in magical history, smiled. And then he turned and walked into the future. Harry remembered every detail of that year, the moment he found the resurrection stone, the night he disrupted Voldemort's ritual, the whispers of his growing legend. But most of all, he remembered the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd won. He'd saved everyone. He'd defeated Voldemort once and for all. The war was over. But Harry's work had just begun. He had a network to maintain, a world to rebuild, a legacy to protect. And he would never stop. He would never let anyone else become a pawn in someone else's game. He would always be the boy who lived, but he would also be the boy who planned. The boy who strategized. The boy who won. The end of Chapter 4. # turning the enemy against himself. # Chapter 5. The aftermath of Voldemort's temporary defeat was not what Harry had expected. He'd imagined a world where the darkness lifted, where people celebrated, where the fear that had gripped the wizarding world for so long finally dissipated. Instead, he found himself in a world that was still fractured, still suspicious, still afraid. Voldemort's physical form had been destroyed, but his ideology lived on. The Death Eaters were scattered, but they were still out there, still plotting, still waiting for their master to return. Harry understood now that defeating Voldemort was not the end of the war. It was merely the beginning of a different phase. A phase where the enemy was no longer a single, identifiable threat but a network of ideologies, loyalties, and fears that had taken root in the hearts of wizards and witches across Britain. He spent the months after the battle in a state of restless activity. The network had grown to include hundreds of contacts, spanning every sector of magical society. He had agents in the Ministry, in the pureblood families, in the underground resistance movements. He had access to information that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. But information alone wasn't enough. He needed to act. He needed to turn Voldemort's own followers against each other. He needed to destroy the Death Eaters from within. The first seeds of the plan were planted on a cold winter night, in a hidden room behind the fourth-floor tapestry at Hogwarts. Harry sat at a small table, surrounded by maps and documents, his quill scratching against the parchment as he worked. Hermione sat across from him, her brow furrowed in concentration. Ron paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Lucius Malfoy is the key, Harry said, not looking up from his work. He's the most influential Death Eater still at large. If we can turn him against the others, the entire network will collapse. But how do we turn him? Ron asked. He's been loyal to Voldemort for decades. He's not going to betray him just because we ask nicely. Harry smiled. We don't need to ask nicely. We just need to make him believe that Voldemort has already betrayed him. Hermione looked up, her eyes sharp with understanding. We feed him false information. Make him think that Voldemort is planning to sacrifice him. That the other Death Eaters are plotting against him. Exactly. Harry leaned forward, his voice low and intense. Lucius is paranoid. He's been on the run for months, hiding from the Aurors, watching his back. He's already suspicious of everyone. All we have to do is give him a reason to be suspicious of the people he trusts most. Ron stopped pacing and stared at him. You're going to make them kill each other. I'm going to make them destroy themselves. It's the most effective way to eliminate a threat without lifting a wand. The plan required precision, patience, and an almost surgical understanding of the Death Eater's psychology. Harry began with Lucius Malfoy. He used his network to plant a series of carefully crafted rumors, whispers that reached Lucius through multiple channels, making them seem more credible. The rumors suggested that Voldemort was planning to sacrifice Lucius in his next attempt to return to power. That Bellatrix Lestrange was maneuvering to take his place. That other Death Eaters were already making deals with the Ministry to save themselves. At first, Lucius dismissed the rumors. He was a loyal servant, a devoted follower. He wouldn't turn on his master so easily. But Harry was patient. He kept feeding the rumors, kept adding details, kept making them more specific and more personal. He leaked information about Lucius's financial dealings, about his secret meetings, about the private conversations he'd had with other Death Eaters. He made Lucius believe that his secrets were being shared with his enemies. The first crack appeared after 3 months. Harry received word from his agent in Malfoy Manor, a house elf who'd been turned through careful manipulation, that Lucius had started to question his position. He'd been seen arguing with Bellatrix, accusing her of undermining him. He'd started making secret inquiries about the Ministry's amnesty program. Harry smiled when he read the report. The trap was working. The next phase of the plan was more ambitious. Harry identified the other Death Eaters who were most likely to turn on each other, the ones with old grudges, personal rivalries, competing ambitions. He created a web of false information that played on their fears and suspicions. He made each of them believe that the others were plotting against them. The Slytherin network was invaluable. For this phase, Harry had cultivated contacts in every pureblood family, including some who were still loyal to Voldemort. These contacts fed the rumors, passed along the false information, made the Death Eaters believe that their own friends were betraying them. It started small. A whispered comment here, a suspicious glance there. But it grew quickly, feeding on the paranoia that had always been a part of the Death Eater culture. Before long, the Death Eaters were turning on each other with a ferocity that surprised even Harry. Lucius Malfoy was the first to break. He'd been receiving anonymous messages for weeks, warning him that Bellatrix was planning to expose his secret dealings with the Ministry. He confronted her publicly, at a meeting of the Inner Circle, and the argument escalated into a full-blown duel. Bellatrix was arrested the next day, after a tip-off from an anonymous source. She was convicted of multiple murders and sent to Azkaban for life. Harry felt a grim satisfaction when he heard the news. Bellatrix was one of Voldemort's most loyal followers. Without her, the Death Eaters had lost their most dangerous weapon. But Harry wasn't satisfied with just one victory. He wanted to destroy them all. He turned his attention to the other Death Eaters, using the same techniques he'd used on Lucius and Bellatrix. He fed them false information, played on their fears, made them believe that they were being targeted by their own allies. Within a year, the Death Eater network had been decimated. Several key members had been arrested. Others had fled the country. A few had even turned themselves into the Ministry, hoping for leniency. The ones who remained were the most dangerous, the true believers, the ones who would never give up their loyalty to Voldemort. But they were also the most isolated. Cut off from their allies, hunted by the Aurors, they had no one to turn to. Harry watched them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The internal conflict among the Death Eaters had consequences far beyond Harry's expectations. Rumors of the infighting reached the wider wizarding world, and the public's perception of Voldemort's movement shifted. People who had once feared the Death Eaters now saw them as a fractured, desperate group of criminals. The fear that had held the wizarding world in its grip for so long began to dissipate. The Ministry, emboldened by the Death Eaters' weakness, launched a series of crackdowns. They arrested dozens of suspected Death Eaters, raided their properties, confiscated their assets. The Auror Department, which had been crippled by corruption and incompetence, was suddenly functioning at full capacity. Harry watched the chaos with satisfaction. He'd created a situation where both sides, the Death Eaters and the Ministry, were weakened by their own internal conflicts. and he was positioned perfectly to take advantage of the chaos. But he wasn't finished yet. There was still one more piece of the plan to execute. The final phase of the plan was the most dangerous. Harry had identified a group of Death Eaters who were planning to join forces with a faction of dark wizards from Eastern Europe. The alliance would have been devastating, a united front of dark magic that could have overwhelmed the wizarding world. Harry couldn't allow that to happen. He used his network to sabotage the alliance, spreading rumors that the Eastern European wizards were actually Ministry agents. He leaked false information about the meeting location, causing the Death Eaters to walk into an ambush. He provided the Aurors with detailed intelligence about the Death Eaters' plans, allowing them to arrest the entire group. It was a masterstroke. The Death Eaters were decimated, their leadership imprisoned or dead. The Eastern European faction, humiliated by the failed alliance, retreated into their own territory. The threat of a united Dark Front had been eliminated. Harry stood in his hidden room, staring at the map of the wizarding world. The red markers that represented Death Eater cells were scattered, isolated, fading. The network he'd built had done its job. The enemy had turned on itself. But he knew the war wasn't over. Voldemort was still out there, still plotting, still waiting for his chance to return. And when he did, Harry would be ready. The months that followed were quiet, but Harry knew it was the calm before the storm. He continued to build his network, expanding his contacts, gathering information. He trained relentlessly, honing his skills, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He studied Voldemort's strategies, his weaknesses, his patterns. He developed contingency plans for every scenario he could imagine. Hermione and Ron stood by him, their loyalty unwavering. They'd become more than friends. They were his strategists, his confidants, his most trusted allies. Together, they'd built something that had never existed before, a network that spanned the entire wizarding world, a force that could move in the shadows and change the course of history. But Harry couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something bigger than anything he'd faced before. He felt it in his scar, the constant ache that had never fully disappeared. He felt it in his dreams, the whispered promises of power and pain. He felt it in his bones, the certainty that the war was far from over. The first sign of Voldemort's return came in the spring of Harry's 6th year. Harry was in the library, studying for his NEWTS, when he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his scar. He gasped, dropping his quill, and clutched his forehead. Hermione was at his side immediately. "Harry? What's wrong?" "It's Voldemort," Harry said through gritted teeth. "He's coming back. I can feel him." Ron's face went pale. "How?" "We destroyed all the Horcruxes. We stopped the ritual." Harry shook his head. "He found another way. A different ritual." "I don't know how, but I know it's happening." The library was silent, the other students staring at them with wide eyes. Harry could feel their fear, their uncertainty. The war they thought was over was just beginning again. He stood, his legs shaking. "I need to go to the Order. I need to warn them." Hermione grabbed his arm. "Harry, wait. Think about this. If you go to the Order, they'll want to fight. They'll want to attack Voldemort directly. But that's exactly what he wants. He's expecting us to react, to rush in without a plan." Harry stopped, forcing himself to think. She was right. Of course she was right. Acting on impulse was exactly what Voldemort wanted. It was exactly what Harry would have done a few years ago. But he wasn't the same person he'd been. He'd learned to be patient. To be strategic. To wait for the right moment to strike. "Fine," he said quietly. "We'll wait. We'll gather information. We'll find out what Voldemort is planning." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Harry mobilized his network, sending out coded messages to his contacts across the wizarding world. He needed information about Voldemort's return, how it had happened, where he was hiding, what he was planning. The answers came slowly, piece by piece. Voldemort had found a way to return using a combination of dark magic and ancient ritual. He was hiding in a remote location in Eastern Europe, gathering his remaining followers. He was planning a series of attacks across Britain, designed to destabilize the ministry and spread fear among the populace. Harry studied the information carefully, looking for patterns. He knew Voldemort's strategies, his weaknesses, his patterns. He knew how to predict his moves. The attacks were coming. Harry could feel them in his scar, in his dreams, in his bones. But he also knew how to stop them. He developed a plan. It was risky, dangerous, but it was also brilliant. He would use Voldemort's own followers against him. He would turn the Death Eaters into a weapon that would destroy their master from within. The plan required careful preparation. Harry started by identifying the Death Eaters who were most likely to turn on Voldemort. The ones who were disillusioned, scared, desperate. The ones who had families they wanted to protect. The ones who'd already started to question their loyalty. He approached them carefully, using intermediaries from his network. He didn't ask them to betray Voldemort, not yet. He just offered them an alternative. A way out. A chance to save themselves and their families. Some of them accepted immediately, their fear overriding their loyalty. Others took more time, more persuasion. But eventually, Harry had a network of informants within the Death Eater ranks, feeding him information about Voldemort's plans. He used the information carefully, selectively. He didn't want to tip off Voldemort too soon. He needed to let the trap spring at exactly the right moment. The attacks came, just as Harry had predicted. But they were weaker than Voldemort had hoped. The Ministry was ready, thanks to Harry's intelligence. The casualties were minimal. The damage was contained. Voldemort was furious. He'd expected his attacks to shock and demoralize the wizarding world. Instead, they'd been met with resistance. He started to suspect that someone was leaking his plans. And that's when Harry made his move. He planted false information through his informants, making it seem like one of Voldemort's most loyal followers was the leak. The evidence was carefully constructed, designed to look like it had been discovered accidentally. Voldemort's paranoia, always his greatest weakness, did the rest. He confronted the follower, accused him of betrayal, and killed him in a rage. The other Death Eaters watched, horrified. They'd seen their master turn on one of his own. They'd seen what happened to anyone who fell out of his favor. Harry had planted the seeds of doubt. And now he watched them grow. The disintegration of the Death Eater network was surprisingly quick. Voldemort, consumed by paranoia, started turning on his own followers. He accused them of disloyalty, tortured them for information, killed them when they failed to satisfy him. The Death Eaters, terrified and betrayed, started to turn on each other. Harry fed the chaos, spreading rumors and false information. He made it seem like the Ministry was closing in, like the Aurors had infiltrated every cell. He made the Death Eaters believe that their only hope was to run. And they did. By the end of the summer, the Death Eater network had collapsed. Most of the remaining followers had fled the country or gone into hiding. The few who remained were scattered, isolated, powerless. Harry watched the chaos from the shadows, his face expressionless. He'd done it. He'd turned the enemy against itself. He'd destroyed Voldemort's network without ever facing him in direct combat. But he knew the war wasn't over. Voldemort was still out there, still plotting, still waiting for his chance to return. And when he did, Harry would need to be ready. The night before the start of his 7th year, Harry stood in his hidden room and looked at the map of the wizarding world. The red markers that represented Voldemort's forces were scattered, fading. The green markers that represented his allies were strong, numerous, organized. He'd built something that had never existed before, a network that spanned the entire wizarding world, a force that could move in the shadows and change the course of history. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing. One threat that he hadn't been able to eliminate. Voldemort himself. Harry touched his scar, feeling the familiar ache. He'd been fighting this war for years, and he was tired. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Not until Voldemort was gone for good. He looked at the map and made a decision. It was time to end this. Time to face Voldemort directly. Time to finish what he'd started. But he wasn't going to do it alone. He had his network, his allies, his friends. He had everything he needed to win. And when the final confrontation came, Harry would be ready. The months that followed were the most challenging of Harry's life. He spent his days studying, training, preparing. He spent his nights working with his network, gathering intelligence, planning his next moves. He barely slept, barely ate, barely stopped moving. Hermione and Ron were worried about him. He could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices. But they didn't try to stop him. They knew better. They knew that stopping Harry Potter was like stopping the wind. The final confrontation came on a cold winter night, in a graveyard that Harry had visited before. Voldemort was there, surrounded by his remaining followers. He'd emerged from hiding, finally ready to face Harry directly. He was confident, arrogant, convinced that he would win. Harry faced him with calm determination. He'd been preparing for this moment his whole life. He'd built an empire in the shadows. He'd destroyed the Death Eater network. He'd weakened Voldemort at every turn. And now, it was time to finish it. The battle was brief. Harry's network had prepared the ground carefully, removing Voldemort's advantages, neutralizing his protections. The Death Eaters, broken and scattered, were no match for Harry's allies. Voldemort fought with desperation, but his power was fading. The Horcruxes were gone. His followers were gone. He was alone. Harry faced him, their wands raised. The ancient magic swirled around them, crackling with power. "It's over, Voldemort," Harry said quietly. "You've lost. You've always been losing. You just didn't realize it." Voldemort screamed and lunged. Harry dodged and struck. The spell was simple, but it was backed by years of practice, years of preparation. It flew from his wand, fast and true, and struck Voldemort in the chest. The Dark Lord collapsed, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. His body dissolved into ash, his soul shattering into nothing. The war was over. Voldemort was gone. And Harry had won. Harry stood in the silence, his heart pounding, his body aching. He was alone in the graveyard, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen. The battle was over. He'd won. But he didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. Worn. Ancient. He thought about the friends he'd lost, the sacrifices he'd made, the years he'd spent fighting. He thought about the future, about the world he was trying to create. And he smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible in the darkness. But it was real. He turned and walked away from the graveyard, his steps steady and sure. The war was over. The work had just begun. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the greatest strategist in magical history, walked into the future. The end of Chapter 5. #The Perfect Trap. #Chapter 6. The year after Voldemort's second defeat was supposed to be one of peace. Harry had expected celebration, rebuilding, a chance to finally rest. Instead, he found himself in a world that was more fractured than ever. The Death Eaters had been scattered, but their ideology remained. The Ministry had been shaken, but its corruption persisted. And somewhere in the shadows, Harry knew, Voldemort was already planning his return. He felt it in his scar, a constant, low-grade ache that never quite went away. He felt it in his dreams, fragments of visions that showed him a Dark Lord who was desperate, angry, and absolutely determined to come back. Harry had destroyed Voldemort's Horcruxes. He'd turned the Death Eaters against each other. He'd weakened the Dark Lord's power at every turn. But Voldemort was like a weed that kept growing back, no matter how many times you pulled it up. He would find another way. He would always find another way. Harry needed to be ready. The first sign that something was wrong came in the autumn of his 7th year. Harry was in his hidden room, working through a stack of reports from his network, when a messenger owl arrived with a coded letter. He recognized the handwriting. It was from one of his contacts in the Department of Mysteries. Asterisk. The Unspeakables have detected unusual activity. Dark magic signatures, concentrated in the north of England. We believe someone is attempting to access a sealed vault. A vault that hasn't been opened in centuries. Asterisk. Harry's blood ran cold. He knew exactly which vault they were talking about. The vault that contained Voldemort's final contingency plan, the one Harry had never been able to identify. He'd known about the vault for years. He'd known it was hidden somewhere in the north, protected by ancient magic. But he'd never been able to find it, never been able to discover what it contained. Now it seemed that Voldemort had found a way to access it. Or someone acting on his behalf. Harry mobilized his network immediately. He needed to know what was in the vault. He needed to know who was trying to open it. And he needed to stop them before they succeeded. The investigation took weeks. Harry's contacts traced the dark magic signatures to a remote location in the Yorkshire Dales. The area was desolate, uninhabited, perfect for hiding something that was meant to stay hidden. Harry traveled there in secret, using the network's resources to avoid detection. The vault was hidden beneath a hill, protected by a series of wards and enchantments. Harry could feel the ancient magic pulsing through the ground, ancient and powerful. He'd never encountered anything like it. He approached carefully, studying the wards, looking for weaknesses. The vault was sealed with a combination of blood magic and family magic, the kind that could only be opened by someone with the right ancestry. Harry realized, with a sinking feeling, that Voldemort had the right ancestry. The Gaunt family had been one of the oldest pure-blood families in Britain. Their bloodline was connected to the vault in ways that Harry couldn't replicate. He needed another way in. He needed to find a loophole, a weakness, a way to circumvent the protections. He spent weeks studying the vault's history, tracing its origins through ancient records and family trees. He discovered that the vault had been created by a branch of the Gaunt family that had died out centuries ago, the branch that had produced Voldemort's maternal grandmother. The key to opening the vault wasn't blood. It was knowledge. The vault was protected by a series of riddles, each one requiring a specific piece of ancient lore. Anyone who could answer the riddles could open the vault, regardless of their ancestry. Harry smiled. Riddles were something he understood. He'd been solving them his whole life. He spent the next month studying the riddles, researching the lore, preparing his answers. And then, on a cold winter night, he returned to the vault and solved the final riddle. The vault opened with a grinding sound, revealing a dark chamber filled with ancient artifacts. Harry stepped inside, his wand raised, his eyes scanning the room. The artifacts were incredible: books, scrolls, weapons, jewels. But Harry's attention was drawn to a single object, sitting on a pedestal in the center of the chamber. A small, ornate box, covered in symbols that he recognized immediately. The box contained a Horcrux. Harry's heart sank. Voldemort had hidden a Horcrux here, in a vault that no one could access. A Horcrux that had survived everything Harry had done to destroy them. But as Harry examined the box more closely, he realized that there was something different about this Horcrux. It wasn't a soul fragment in the traditional sense. It was a contingency plan, a piece of Voldemort's magic that had been designed to activate if the Dark Lord was killed. Harry opened the box carefully, his fingers trembling. Inside lay a small, glass vial filled with a dark, swirling liquid. It was Voldemort's blood. His remaining life force, preserved in case he ever needed to come back. Harry stared at the vial, his mind racing. This was Voldemort's final contingency plan. The one he'd been so careful to hide. The one that could bring him back from the dead. Harry could have destroyed the vial. He could have eliminated Voldemort's last chance at resurrection. But as he held it in his hands, a different idea began to form. A more ambitious idea. A more dangerous idea. What if he didn't destroy the vial? What if he used it instead? What if he let Voldemort come back, on Harry's terms? The plan was audacious, risky, and absolutely brilliant. Harry spent months preparing for it. He gathered information about Voldemort's resurrection ritual, the one the Dark Lord would use when he finally activated his contingency plan. He studied the mechanics of the ritual, identified the components, understood the timing. He knew that the ritual required specific conditions, a particular alignment of the stars, a particular location, a particular combination of sacrifices. Voldemort would need to be at full power to perform it. But if Harry could weaken him first, if he could ensure that Voldemort returned to a body that was weaker than expected, then the Dark Lord would be vulnerable. Harry started working on the sabotage. He identified the components of the ritual that were most susceptible to interference. He developed a series of countermeasures that would work subtly, beneath the notice of anyone performing the ritual. He enlisted the help of his network, planting agents in the key locations where Voldemort's followers would gather. And he waited. The moment came in the spring of Harry's 8th year. Harry felt it in his scar, a sudden, sharp pain that told him Voldemort was making his move. He mobilized his network immediately, sending coded messages to his contacts across the wizarding world. Voldemort had activated his contingency plan. He was performing the resurrection ritual in a remote location in the Scottish Highlands. His followers were gathering, preparing to welcome their master back. Harry moved quickly, his heart pounding with anticipation. He'd prepared for this moment for months. He'd been patient, strategic, patient. And now it was time to act. He arrived at the ritual site just as the ceremony was beginning. He watched from the shadows as Voldemort's followers assembled, as the dark magic gathered around them. He saw Voldemort's new body taking shape, a pale, weak, pathetic thing that was barely more than a skeleton. Harry had done his work well. The sabotage had worked exactly as planned. Voldemort had returned, but he was weaker than ever. His power was diminished. His body was fragile. His followers, who had expected a triumphant return, were shocked and confused. But Harry wasn't finished yet. He had one more piece of the plan to execute. The next phase of the plan was designed to expose Voldemort's return to the wizarding world. Harry had arranged for a group of ministry officials to be in the area, ostensibly on a routine inspection. They'd been tipped off anonymously about the dark magic activity in the Highlands. They'd arrived just in time to witness Voldemort's resurrection. The officials were horrified. They'd spent months convincing themselves that Voldemort was gone for good, that the threat had passed. But now they had seen him with their own eyes. They had proof that he was back. The ministry was thrown into chaos. The minister himself, Cornelius Fudge, had been one of the officials who'd witnessed the resurrection. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't brush it under the carpet. Voldemort was back, and the wizarding world had to face the truth. Harry watched the fallout with grim satisfaction. He'd exposed Voldemort's return. He'd ensured that no one could deny the threat. And he'd forced the ministry to act. But the ministry's response was too slow. Too cautious. Too divided. Fudge, terrified of the political consequences, tried to downplay the threat. He issued statements that were vague and reassuring. He refused to mobilize the Aurors. He insisted that the situation was under control. Harry knew that the minister's inaction would cost lives. But he also knew that he could use it. He started to release evidence through his network, documents that exposed the ministry's corruption, its incompetence, its willingness to sacrifice ordinary wizards for political gain. The evidence was damning, overwhelming, and absolutely undeniable. It showed that the ministry had known about Voldemort's return for months and had done nothing to prepare for it. The public was outraged. Demands for Fudge's resignation filled the Daily Prophet. The Aurors, who'd been told to stand down, mutinied against their corrupt superiors. The entire ministry was in danger of collapse. Harry watched the chaos and smiled. The trap was closing. The final piece of the plan was the most satisfying. Harry had gathered evidence against the corrupt officials who'd been collaborating with the Death Eaters. He documented their crimes, their secret meetings, their financial transactions. And now he made it all public. The revelations were devastating. Dozens of ministry officials were implicated, including several senior members of Fudge's administration. The Death Eater network, which Harry had already weakened, was exposed in its entirety. The public demanded justice. The Aurors, finally free of their corrupt superiors, launched a series of raids. Death Eaters were arrested, properties were seized, families were torn apart. Voldemort's return had been meant to destabilize the wizarding world. Instead, it had unified it against him. The Ministry, forced to act by public pressure, was suddenly fighting the war that Harry had been waging for years. Harry stood in the shadows, watching the chaos unfold. He'd done it. He'd exposed Voldemort's return. He'd exposed the Ministry's corruption. He'd turned the wizarding world against the Dark Lord. But the war wasn't over. Voldemort was still out there, weak but dangerous. And Harry knew that the final confrontation was coming. The summer after his 8th year was the busiest of Harry's life. He spent his days meeting with his network, coordinating the war effort, planning the final assault. He spent his nights in his hidden room, studying Voldemort's movements, identifying his weaknesses, developing his strategies. He was no longer just a soldier in the war. He was a general. A strategist. The one who would lead the wizarding world to victory. The Ministry had finally acknowledged his role in the war. Fudge had been forced to resign, and the new minister, a reformer named Kingsley Shacklebolt, had appointed Harry as a special advisor. It was a symbolic role, mostly. But it gave Harry access to resources he'd never had before. He used those resources carefully. He mobilized the Aurors, the Order, his network. He coordinated attacks on Voldemort's remaining forces. He targeted the Death Eaters' supply lines, their safe houses, their families. He made it impossible for them to operate effectively. The war was turning in Harry's favor. Voldemort was losing. He was desperate, angry, and increasingly reckless. He knew that his time was running out. And he was determined to take Harry with him. Harry felt the Dark Lord's rage through their connection, felt the hatred burning like acid in his veins. He knew that Voldemort would make one final attempt to destroy him. And he knew that the confrontation would be epic. He prepared for it the only way he knew how, with patience, intelligence, and ruthless determination. The night of the final battle was cold and clear. Harry stood on the battlements of Hogwarts, looking out over the grounds. The castle was surrounded by Voldemort's forces, Death Eaters, dark creatures, and wizards who'd been seduced by the promise of power. But Harry's forces were there too. The Order, the Aurors, the students and teachers who'd refused to abandon their school. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and absolutely determined to win. Harry had planned for this moment. He'd prepared for it for years. He knew every inch of the castle, every secret passage, every hidden room. He turned Hogwarts into a fortress, a trap that would destroy anyone who tried to breach it. He watched as the battle began, as the spells flew through the air, as the fighters clashed on the grounds below. He could see Voldemort in the distance, his pale figure glowing with dark magic. The time had come. The final confrontation was imminent. Harry descended from the battlements, his wand raised. He moved through the castle, his steps sure and steady. He could feel Voldemort's presence, pulsing like a dark heartbeat. He met the Dark Lord in the Great Hall. The room was empty, the tables pushed aside. They were alone, facing each other across the stone floor. "Potter," Voldemort hissed. "You've been a thorn in my side for so long. But your luck has finally run out." Harry met his gaze steadily. "It wasn't luck, Voldemort. It was planning. Intelligence. Strategy. The things you've never understood." Voldemort's eyes narrowed. "You think you can defeat me? You're just a boy. A boy who's been nothing but a pawn in everyone's game." "Maybe I was a pawn once," Harry said. "But not anymore. I've been the one moving the pieces for years. And you've been playing right into my hands." Voldemort screamed and lunged. Harry dodged and raised his wand. The spells flew between them, crackling with power. But Harry had planned for this moment. He'd studied Voldemort's patterns, his weaknesses. He knew exactly when to strike. He waited for his opening. He feinted left, then right, then struck with a spell that was simple but devastating. It caught Voldemort in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Voldemort lay there, gasping, his eyes wide with shock. "This isn't over," he spat. "I'll find a way." I'll always find a way. Harry shook his head. No, you won't. The Horcruxes are gone. Your followers are gone. Your power is gone. There's nothing left. Voldemort's face contorted with rage. He tried to raise his wand, but his strength was fading. The dark magic that had sustained him for so long was finally failing. Harry watched as Voldemort's body began to dissolve, as his soul crumbled into nothing. The Dark Lord's final scream echoed through the great hall, and then he was gone. Harry stood in the silence, his heart pounding. It was over. Finally, truly, completely over. The aftermath was a blur. Harry was surrounded by friends, allies, people who wanted to thank him, congratulate him, celebrate him. But he felt hollow inside. He'd spent so long fighting that he didn't know how to stop. He slipped away from the celebration, retreating to his hidden room. He sat in the darkness, staring at the wall, trying to process everything that had happened. He thought about his parents, who'd died to save him. He thought about Sirius, who'd sacrificed himself for Harry's cause. He thought about all the people who'd been lost, all the sacrifices that had been made. But he also thought about the future. About the world he was trying to create. About the people who would live in it after he was gone. He smiled, a small, tired smile. He'd done it. He'd won. Voldemort was gone for good. But the work wasn't over. The healing, the rebuilding, the creating of a new world. He would be there for all of it. He would never stop. He would never give up. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the greatest strategist in magical history, walked out of his hidden room and into the light. The end of Chapter 6. #checkmate. #Chapter 7. The world that emerged after Voldemort's final defeat was not the utopia Harry had imagined. The Dark Lord was gone, his soul scattered to the winds, his followers broken and scattered. But the scars he'd left behind were deep, festering wounds that would take generations to heal. The Ministry was in chaos, its corrupt officials exposed and arrested. The pureblood families were in disarray, their secrets laid bare for all to see. The wizarding world was free, but it was also broken, uncertain, afraid. Harry understood now that winning the war was only the first step. The real challenge was winning the peace. He threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd brought to the war. He worked with Kingsley Shacklebolt, the new minister, to rebuild the Ministry from the ground up. He testified at trials, provided evidence, helped ensure that justice was served. He worked with the Order to heal the wounds that Voldemort had inflicted on the wizarding world. But even as he worked, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That Voldemort had left behind one final trap. One last contingency that Harry hadn't uncovered. The feeling gnawed at him, a constant presence in the back of his mind. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years. They'd kept him alive, kept him ahead of Voldemort, kept him winning. And now they were telling him that the war wasn't over. The discovery came in the winter after Voldemort's defeat. Harry was in his hidden room, the one behind the fourth-floor tapestry at Hogwarts, going through the last of Voldemort's papers. The Dark Lord's personal effects had been seized by the Ministry, and Harry had been given access to them. He'd been searching for any trace of a final contingency, any hint that Voldemort had left behind something that could threaten the wizarding world. He found it in a journal, hidden in a secret compartment in Voldemort's desk. The journal was small, unassuming, written in a code that Harry had never seen before. He spent weeks deciphering it, working with Hermione and his network of experts. When he finally cracked the code, the contents made his blood run cold. Voldemort had been planning for his own death. He'd known that there was a chance he would be defeated, and he'd prepared accordingly. He'd created a network of loyalists, Death Eaters who were so fanatical, so devoted, that they would carry out his final orders even after he was gone. The orders were simple. If Voldemort fell, his followers were to unleash a series of attacks designed to destabilize the wizarding world. The attacks would target key locations: the Ministry, Hogwarts, Diagon Alley. They would spread chaos, fear, and confusion. And they would pave the way for Voldemort's eventual return, whether from the dead or through a successor. Harry read the journal 3 times, his hands trembling. Voldemort had been playing the long game. He'd known that his physical defeat was possible, and he'd prepared accordingly. He'd created a network that would survive his death, a network that would continue his work long after he was gone. But Harry had been playing the long game too. He'd been building his own network, preparing for his own contingencies. And now it was time to use everything he'd learned. The plan was complex, layered, and absolutely ruthless. Harry would use his network to identify and neutralize Voldemort's loyalists before they could act. He would infiltrate their cells, turn their members, destroy their resources. And he would do it all without anyone realizing what was happening. He started with the most dangerous loyalists, the ones who were most likely to act on Voldemort's final orders. He identified them through his network, tracked their movements, monitored their communications. And then he moved against them, one by one. The first target was a group of Death Eaters who'd been planning to attack the Ministry. Harry fed false information to the Aurors, leading them to the group's safe house. The raid was swift, brutal, and completely successful. The Death Eaters were arrested, their weapons seized, their plans destroyed. The second target was a group of Loyalists who'd been planning to bomb Diagon Alley. Harry used his network to infiltrate the group, turning one of its members into an informant. The informant provided detailed intelligence, allowing the Aurors to prevent the attack before it could happen. The third target was a group of fanatics who'd been planning to attack Hogwarts. Harry mobilized the Order, the Aurors, and his network of students to stop them. The attack was foiled, the fanatics captured, their resources seized. Harry moved through the Loyalist network like a ghost, dismantling it piece by piece. He was patient, methodical, and absolutely relentless. He didn't just destroy Voldemort's final contingency. He made sure that nothing like it would ever happen again. But Harry knew that destroying the Loyalists wasn't enough. He needed to prevent anyone from following Voldemort's path in the future. He needed to change the wizarding world itself. He started with the Ministry. Kingsley Shacklebolt had been making progress, but the institution was still deeply corrupt. Harry worked with him to reform the Auror Department, to root out the remaining corruption, to build a system that would be fair and just. He worked with the Wisengamot to reform the laws, to ensure that everyone was treated equally under the law. He worked with the schools to reform the curriculum, to teach the next generation about the dangers of prejudice and hatred. He worked with the pureblood families to challenge their assumptions, to show them that the world had changed. It was slow work, painstaking work. But Harry was patient. He learned patience in the cupboard under the stairs, and he'd never forgotten the lesson. The final piece of the puzzle was the most personal. Harry knew that Voldemort's legacy would continue to haunt him as long as he carried the Dark Lord's magic in his scar. The connection between them had been weakened, but it wasn't completely gone. Harry could still feel Voldemort's presence, a faint echo in the back of his mind. He needed to sever that connection. He needed to destroy the last remnant of Voldemort's magic that lived inside him. Hermione had been researching the problem for months, searching for a way to remove the Horcrux fragment from Harry's soul. She'd found references to an ancient ritual, one that could separate the soul from its vessel without destroying it. The ritual was dangerous. It required the caster to enter the patient's mind, to navigate the labyrinth of their soul, to find and remove the foreign fragment. Any mistake could be fatal. Harry didn't hesitate. He'd been preparing for this moment his whole life. He sat in the hidden room, surrounded by his friends, and let Hermione perform the ritual. The process was excruciating. Harry felt Voldemort's soul fragment fighting back, trying to maintain its hold on him. He felt the pain of separation, the agony of having something torn from his very being. But he endured it, because he knew that it was necessary. And then, finally, it was over. The Horcrux fragment was gone. Harry was free. He opened his eyes, gasping for breath. The room was silent, his friends staring at him with wide eyes. He could feel the difference, the lightness, the peace, the absence of the dark presence that had haunted him for so long. "It's done," he whispered. "He's really gone." Hermione burst into tears. Ron clapped him on the back. The others cheered. Harry sat in the center of it all, feeling the joy of his friends wash over him. He'd done it. He'd destroyed Voldemort's final contingency. He'd cut the last tie that bound him to the Dark Lord. He was free. But the war wasn't over. It would never be over. As long as there were people who believed in pure-blood supremacy, who were willing to use violence to achieve their goals, the fight would continue. Harry understood that now. He'd accepted it. And he was ready for whatever came next. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Harry worked tirelessly to rebuild the wizarding world, using his network to bring together the different factions. He brokered peace between the pure-blood families and the Muggleborns. He helped create a new system of government that was fair, just, and accountable. He trained a new generation of Aurors who would protect the peace. But he also took time for himself. He visited his parents' grave, telling them about everything he'd accomplished. He spent time with Sirius, rebuilding their relationship. He went on holiday with Hermione and Ron, the three of them finally able to relax. He found himself thinking about the future. About the life he wanted to live. About the person he wanted to become. He'd spent so long fighting that he never really thought about what came next. Now, for the first time in his life, he had the freedom to choose. The choice came sooner than he expected. Harry was in the Ministry, meeting with Kingsley about the latest reforms, when the news arrived. There had been another attack. A group of pure-blood extremists had attacked a Muggle-born community, killing dozens. Harry's blood ran cold. He thought the war was over. He thought the violence was behind them. But the extremists were still out there, still determined to destroy everything he'd built. He mobilized the network immediately. He needed to find the extremists, to stop them before they could attack again. He needed to understand their motivations, their connections, their plans. The investigation was intense. Harry worked day and night, following leads, interrogating suspects, gathering evidence. He was relentless, determined, absolutely ruthless. And finally, he found them. The extremists were hiding in a remote location in the Scottish Highlands, planning their next attack. Harry led the raid himself, capturing the extremists and preventing their attack. But the experience left him shaken. He'd thought that defeating Voldemort would end the violence. He'd thought that the wizarding world would finally be at peace. Now he realized that the peace was fragile, constantly threatened by the forces of hatred and fear. And he realized that the fight would never be over. It would always be there, a constant presence, a constant challenge. He accepted that reality. And he prepared himself for the long fight ahead. The final confrontation came on a cold winter night, a year after Voldemort's defeat. Harry had been tracking the last remaining Loyalists, a group of fanatics who'd refused to accept Voldemort's death. They'd been planning a final attack, a desperate attempt to reclaim the glory of the Dark Lord's reign. Harry confronted them in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of London. The Loyalists were outnumbered, outmatched, but they were also desperate. They fought with a ferocity that Harry hadn't expected. The battle was brief but brutal. Harry moved through the warehouse like a ghost, his wand flashing with spells that were precise, powerful, and completely devastating. He took down the Loyalists one by one, until only their leader remained. The leader was a man Harry had never met, but whose face he recognized from the old records. He was a Death Eater who'd been presumed dead, a fanatic who'd dedicated his life to Voldemort's cause. "You think you've won, Potter?" the man spat. "The Dark Lord's legacy will live on. His followers will never give up. We'll fight forever." Harry shook his head. "You're wrong. I've been fighting this war for years. I've been planning for it, preparing for it. And I've won. Every single time. Because I understand what you don't, that the fight is never over. It's always there, always waiting. And I'll always be ready." The man lunged. Harry dodged and struck. The spell caught the Loyalist in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. It was over. The last of the Loyalists was defeated. Harry stood in the silence, his heart pounding. He'd won. He'd defeated Voldemort's Final contingency. He'd ended the war. But he knew that the battle would continue. There would always be someone who wanted to bring back the old ways. There would always be someone who wanted to destroy what he'd built. Harry accepted that. He'd learned to live with it. He'd learned to fight for it. He turned and walked away from the warehouse, his steps steady and sure. The war was over. The fight was just beginning. The years that followed were the most rewarding of Harry's life. He continued to work with the ministry, helping to rebuild the wizarding world. He trained a new generation of Aurors, teaching them the skills they need to protect the peace. He worked with the schools, helping to create a curriculum that would teach children about the dangers of prejudice and hatred. But he also found time for himself. He married Ginny Weasley, the woman he'd loved since childhood. They had children, a family, a life together. He watched his children grow, their laughter filling the house with joy. He never forgot the war. He never forgot the sacrifices that had been made. But he also never let the war define him. He was more than the boy who lived. He was more than the greatest strategist in magical history. He was Harry Potter, a man who'd faced impossible odds and won. A man who'd lost everything and rebuilt it all. A man who'd learned that the greatest victory wasn't defeating a Dark Lord, it was building a world where Dark Lords would never rise again. The night of his 50th birthday, Harry stood on the battlements of Hogwarts and looked out over the grounds. The castle was peaceful, quiet, the same as it had always been. But Harry knew it had changed. He'd changed it. He made it better. He thought about the war, about the battles he'd fought, the sacrifices he'd made. He thought about his parents, who'd died to save him. He thought about Sirius, who'd given his life for Harry's cause. He thought about all the people who'd been lost, all the futures that had been stolen. But he also thought about the future. About the world he'd helped create. About the children who would grow up in a world without Voldemort, without the fear that had haunted Harry's generation. He smiled. He'd done it. He'd won. Not just the war, but the peace. He'd built something that would outlast him, something that would survive for generations. He turned and walked back into the castle, his steps steady and sure. The war was over. The peace was his victory. And Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the greatest strategist in magical history, walked into the future with a smile on his face. The night before the final confrontation, Harry had stood in his hidden room, staring at the map of the wizarding world. The red markers that represented Voldemort's forces were scattered, fading. The green markers that represented his allies were strong, numerous, organized. He'd looked at the map and made a decision. It was time to end this. Time to face Voldemort directly. Time to finish what he'd started. He'd prepared for years. He'd built a network that spanned the entire wizarding world, a force that could move in the shadows and change the course of history. He'd turned the Death Eaters against each other, weakened Voldemort's power, exposed the Ministry's corruption. Now it was time for the final move. The checkmate. Harry had walked into the Great Hall, his wand raised, his eyes fixed on Voldemort. The Dark Lord had stood there, surrounded by his remaining followers, his face twisted with rage. "You've been a thorn in my side, Potter," Voldemort had hissed. "But your luck has finally run out." Harry had shaken his head. "It wasn't luck, Voldemort. It was planning. Intelligence. Strategy. The things you've never understood." The battle had been brief. Harry had been too prepared, too focused, too determined. Voldemort had been too weak, too desperate, too arrogant. The spell had flown from Harry's wand, fast and true, and Voldemort had fallen. The Dark Lord's body had dissolved into ash, his soul shattering into nothing. The war was over. Harry had won. But the work wasn't over. The healing, the rebuilding, the creating of a new world. Harry would be there for all of it. He would never stop. He would never give up. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the greatest strategist in magical history, walked out of the hidden room and into the light. The final checkmate had been played. The game was over. And Harry had won. The end of Chapter 7. Hashtag the greatest wizarding victory. Hashtag Chapter 8. The morning of the final confrontation dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Harry stood at the window of his room at Hogwarts, looking out over the grounds. The castle was quiet, peaceful, its ancient stones humming with the magic that had protected it for centuries. But Harry knew that peace was about to shatter. He knew that by the end of the day, the castle would be scarred, the grounds soaked with blood. He'd known this moment was coming for years. He'd prepared for it, planned for it, dreamed about it. But now that it was here, he felt strangely calm. The fear that had haunted him for so long had faded, replaced by a quiet certainty. He was ready. He'd always been ready. He touched his forehead, feeling the familiar ache of his scar. It was faint now, barely a whisper of the pain that had once consumed him. The Horcrux was gone. Voldemort's hold on him was broken. He was free. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. There was still one final battle to fight. One final confrontation to face. Harry turned from the window and began to prepare. The Great Hall was filled with students, teachers, and members of the Order. They were all looking at Harry, their faces a mix of fear, hope, and determination. They were all waiting for him to speak. Harry stood at the front of the hall, his wand in his hand, his voice steady and calm. He told them what was coming. He told them about Voldemort's final assault, about the Death Eater's plan to destroy Hogwarts. He told them that they were outnumbered, outmatched, and that many of them would not survive the day. But he also told them that they would win. He told them that he'd been planning for this moment for years, that he'd prepared for every contingency. He told them that Voldemort's power was broken, his followers scattered, his Horcruxes destroyed. He told them that they were fighting for the future, for a world where fear and hatred would no longer rule. The hall was silent when he finished. And then, slowly, a cheer began to build. It started with the Gryffindors, spread to the Hufflepuffs, the Ravenclaws, even some of the Slytherins. It grew and swelled, filling the great hall with a sound that was defiant, triumphant, and absolutely certain. Harry smiled. He'd done his part. Now it was time for the battle to begin. The battle for Hogwarts was unlike anything Harry had ever experienced. He'd fought in battles before, been in the thick of the fighting, felt the rush of adrenaline and the terror of near death. But this was different. This was the culmination of everything he'd been working toward. This was the final confrontation. He moved through the castle, his wand raised, his eyes scanning for threats. The Death Eaters had breached the outer defenses, were flooding into the castle, spreading chaos and destruction. Harry fought them with everything he had, his spells flying fast and true. But he wasn't just fighting. He was commanding, directing, strategizing. The network that he built over so many years was now fully mobilized, acting on his orders, moving in perfect coordination. The Order, the Aurors, the students, they were all part of his plan. The battle was brutal. The Death Eaters fought with the desperation of the damned, knowing that they had no escape. But Harry's forces fought with the determination of those who had nothing left to lose. Harry watched the battle unfold, his mind working constantly, adjusting the plan to meet the changing circumstances. He'd prepared for this. He'd prepared for everything. And then, suddenly, the battle was over. The Death Eaters were defeated, scattered, retreating. The castle was saved. The war was won. Harry stood in the middle of the great hall, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen, his friends and allies looking to him for guidance. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. There was still one final confrontation to face. Voldemort was waiting for him in the courtyard. The Dark Lord stood in the center of the space, surrounded by his remaining followers. He was pale, thin, his body weak from the failed resurrection ritual. But his eyes burned with a cold, terrible fire. He was furious, desperate, and absolutely determined to destroy Harry. "Potter," Voldemort hissed. "You've been a thorn in my side for so long. But your luck has finally run out. You've defeated my followers, destroyed my Horcruxes, turned my allies against me. But you cannot defeat me. I am immortal, I am eternal. You are nothing. Harry walked forward, his steps steady and sure. He could feel the weight of the moment, the importance of everything that was about to happen. But he also felt a strange sense of calm. He'd prepared for this. He'd been preparing for this his whole life. You're wrong, Voldemort, Harry said. I've been planning for this moment for years. I've been 3 steps ahead of you at every turn. You think you're immortal? You think you can't be defeated? You're wrong. You've been wrong about everything. Voldemort's face contorted with rage. You lie. You're just a boy. A pathetic, weak, stupid boy who's been nothing but a pawn. I was a pawn once, Harry said quietly. But not anymore. I've been the one moving the pieces for years. You just didn't realize it. Every move you made, every plan you hatched, I was there, manipulating it, turning it to my advantage. You've been playing right into my hands from the very beginning. Voldemort screamed and lunged. The spells flew between them, crackling with power. Harry dodged and weaved, his movements fluid and precise. He'd been practicing for this moment, training for it, preparing for it. He knew every move Voldemort would make before he made it. And then, suddenly, the duel was over. Harry had struck Voldemort with a spell that was simple but devastating. It had caught the Dark Lord in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Voldemort lay there, gasping, his eyes wide with shock. This isn't possible. Voldemort whispered. I was supposed to win. I was supposed to be immortal. Harry shook his head. You were never immortal, Voldemort. You were always mortal. You just didn't realize it. And now, it's time to face the consequences of your choices. Voldemort's body began to dissolve, his soul shattering into nothing. His final scream echoed through the courtyard, a sound of pure, absolute despair. And then he was gone. The war was over. The victory was won. Harry stood in the silence, his heart pounding, his body aching. He was exhausted, drained, barely able to stand. But he was alive. He'd won. He'd defeated Voldemort once and for all. The courtyard was filled with the bodies of the fallen, the wounded, the dying. But there was also hope, a sense of victory, a belief that the future would be better. Harry's friends and allies surrounded him, their faces a mix of awe and gratitude. Hermione was crying. Ron was grinning. Neville was looking at him with respect. They'd done it. They'd won. They'd survived. But Harry knew that the victory wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who'd fought, everyone who'd sacrificed, everyone who'd believed that things could change. It belonged to his parents, who'd died to save him. It belonged to Sirius, who'd given his life for Harry's cause. It belonged to all the people who'd been lost, all the futures that had been stolen. And it belonged to the future. To the world that Harry had helped create. To the generations who would grow up in a world without Voldemort, without the fear that had haunted Harry's generation. The years that followed were the most rewarding of Harry's life. He continued to work with the Ministry, helping to rebuild the wizarding world. He trained a new generation of Aurors, teaching them the skills they need to protect the peace. He worked with the schools, helping to create a curriculum that would teach children about the dangers of prejudice and hatred. But he also found time for himself. He married Ginny Weasley, the woman he'd loved since childhood. They had children, a family, a life together. He watched his children grow, their laughter filling the house with joy. He never forgot the war. He never forgot the sacrifices that had been made. But he also never let the war define him. He was more than the boy who lived. He was more than the greatest strategist in magical history. He was Harry Potter, a man who'd faced impossible odds and won. A man who'd lost everything and rebuilt it all. A man who'd learned that the greatest victory wasn't defeating a Dark Lord, it was building a world where Dark Lords would never rise again. The night of his 50th birthday, Harry stood on the battlements of Hogwarts and looked out over the grounds. The castle was peaceful, quiet, the same as it had always been. But Harry knew it had changed. He'd changed it. He'd made it better. He thought about the war, about the battles he'd fought, the sacrifices he'd made. He thought about his parents, who'd died to save him. He thought about Sirius, who'd given his life for Harry's cause. He thought about all the people who'd been lost, all the futures that had been stolen. But he also thought about the future. About the world he'd helped create. About the children who would grow up in a world without Voldemort, without the fear that had haunted Harry's generation. He smiled. He'd done it. He'd won. Not just the war, but the peace. He'd built something that would outlast him, something that would survive for generations. He turned and walked back into the castle, his steps steady and sure. The war was over. The peace was his victory. Harry Potter's legacy was unlike any that had come before. The wizarding world remembered him not just as the boy who lived, but as the greatest strategist in magical history. They told stories of his brilliance, his patience, his absolute determination. They spoke of him as the one who had outsmarted Voldemort at every turn, who had turned the Dark Lord's own followers against him, who had destroyed the Horcruxes and ended the war. The history books were filled with his accomplishments. They described his network, the invisible empire he built in the shadows. They detailed his plans, his strategies, his victories. They painted a picture of a young man who had faced impossible odds and won, who had done what no one else could do. But the stories weren't just about Harry's victories. They were also about his humanity, his compassion, his willingness to sacrifice everything for the people he loved. They told of his kindness to his friends, his loyalty to his allies, his determination to protect the innocent. Harry never sought fame. He never asked for recognition. But he couldn't escape it. He was a symbol, a legend, a living embodiment of everything that was good and right about the wizarding world. And he used that symbol to inspire others. He gave speeches, wrote books, worked tirelessly to build a better world. He never rested, never stopped, never gave up. He was always fighting, always planning, always moving forward. Because he knew, deep in his heart, that the fight would never be over. There would always be another threat, another challenge, another battle. But he also knew that he would always be ready. He would always be prepared. He would always be 3 steps ahead. The day of Harry's retirement was a day of celebration. The entire wizarding world came together to honor him. The ministry, the order, the schools, the families, they all gathered at Hogwarts to thank him for everything he'd done. They gave speeches, presented awards, told stories of his bravery and brilliance. Harry listened to them all, his eyes moist with emotion. He'd never expected to be honored like this. He'd never expected to be celebrated. He'd just done what he'd always done, what was right. But as the celebration continued, Harry found himself thinking about the future. About the people who would carry on his work. About the world that would exist after he was gone. He looked at his children, his grandchildren, the new generation of wizards and witches who would inherit the world he'd helped create. He saw their faces, full of hope and determination. He saw the future. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he'd done the right thing. He'd won. Not just the war, but the peace. Harry Potter died on a warm summer evening, surrounded by the people he loved. He was old, tired, and ready to go. He'd lived a full life, a good life, a life that had made a difference. He'd built a world that would survive without him, a world that would thrive and grow and become something beautiful. The wizarding world mourned his death, but they also celebrated his life. They remembered everything he'd done, everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd achieved. They called him the greatest wizard who had ever lived. The greatest strategist. The greatest leader. The greatest hero. But Harry didn't think of himself as a hero. He'd just done what needed to be done. He'd fought the fight that had to be fought. He'd built the world that had to be built. He was Harry Potter, the boy who lived. The boy who refused to be a pawn. The boy who built an invisible empire. The boy who outsmarted Voldemort at every turn. And he was at peace. The story of Harry Potter would be told. For generations. Children would hear of his adventures, his battles, his victories. They would learn about the war he'd fought, the sacrifices he'd made, the world he'd built. They would grow up in a world without Voldemort, without the fear that had haunted Harry's generation. But they would also understand the cost of that world. They would understand the price that had been paid for peace. They would understand that freedom was never free. And they would remember Harry Potter, the greatest strategist in magical history, and they would be inspired. They would fight their own battles, build their own world, create their own legacy. Because that was the greatest victory of all. Not just defeating the Dark Lord. Not just winning the war. But building a world where Dark Lords would never rise again. A world where courage, wisdom, and love would always triumph over fear, hatred, and despair. Harry Potter had done that. He'd done what no one else could do. He'd built a better world for everyone. And that, more than anything else, was his greatest victory. The night before the final confrontation, Harry had stood in his hidden room, looking at the map of the wizarding world. The red markers that represented Voldemort's forces were scattered, fading. The green markers that represented his allies were strong, numerous, organized. He'd thought about everything he'd done, everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd achieved. He'd thought about the war, the battles, the friends he'd lost. He'd thought about the future, the world he was trying to build. And he'd made a decision. He was going to face Voldemort. He was going to win. He was going to end the war. He walked to the window and looked out over the grounds. The castle was quiet, peaceful, the same as it had always been. But Harry knew it was about to change. Everything was about to change. He touched his scar, feeling the faint ache that had been with him for so long. It was weak now, barely a whisper of the pain that had once consumed him. The Horcrux was gone. Voldemort's hold on him was broken. He smiled. He was ready. He'd always been ready. He turned away from the window and walked out of the room. The final confrontation was coming. The final battle was about to begin. And Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the greatest strategist in magical history, was going to win. The end. Harry Potter's victory over Voldemort was the greatest in wizarding history. Not because of the power of his spells, or the ferocity of his fighting, or the bravery of his heart. It was the greatest victory because it was achieved through intelligence, strategy, and sheer determination. Harry had outsmarted Voldemort at every turn. He'd been 3 steps ahead from the very beginning. He'd used the Dark Lord's own strengths against him, turned his followers against him, destroyed his Horcruxes and broken his power. The wizarding world remembered Harry as the greatest strategist in magical history. The one who'd seen the board, understood the game, and played it better than anyone else. The one who'd refused to be a pawn, who'd built an invisible empire, who'd turned the enemy against itself. The one who'd set the perfect trap, and then, when the moment was right, delivered the final checkmate. They remembered his wisdom, his patience, his unwavering determination. They remembered his kindness, his compassion, his willingness to sacrifice everything for the people he loved. They remembered the world he built, a world without fear, without hatred, without dark lords. And they honored him. They built statues, wrote books, told stories. They taught their children about Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the greatest wizard who had ever lived. But Harry didn't care about the statues or the books or the stories. He cared about the world he'd built, the people he'd saved, the future he'd created. He cared about his family, his friends, his legacy. He was Harry Potter, and he'd done what no one else could do. He'd won. He'd defeated Voldemort. He'd built a better world. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest wizarding victory. The story of Harry Potter was a story of courage, wisdom, and love. A story of a boy who'd refused to be a pawn, who'd built an invisible empire, who'd turned the enemy against himself. A story of a man who'd set the perfect trap, delivered the final checkmate, and won the greatest victory in magical history. It was a story that would be told for generations. A story that would inspire children and adults alike. A story that would remind everyone that the greatest power wasn't magic, wasn't strength, wasn't even courage. The greatest power was intelligence. The ability to see the board, understand the game, and play it better than anyone else. Harry Potter had that power. He'd used it to defeat Voldemort, to build a better world, to create a legacy that would last forever. He'd been the boy who lived, the boy who refused to be a pawn, the boy who outsmarted Voldemort at every turn. And he would always be remembered as the greatest strategist in magical history. The one who'd won the greatest wizarding victory of all. The end. Thank you.